Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world so strange you will question everything you know about privacy. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and as you open your eyes there are 100 people standing around your bed watching you. Watching as you stretch, watching as you get dressed, watching your every move. You cannot ask them to leave. In fact, they are supposed to be there. This was not a nightmare. This was normal for millions of people just a few centuries ago. Welcome to the early modern world where privacy did not exist and the rules around it were absolutely hilarious. So before we dive deep into this fascinating story together, I want to ask you something. If you are enjoying what you are hearing right now, would you take just a moment to subscribe to this channel? Hit that like button if this topic intrigues you, and maybe share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. Also, I am genuinely curious, where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you in bed ready to drift off on a long drive, taking a walk? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you and your comments truly make my day. Now get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise. Let us travel back in time together and explore one of the strangest periods in human history. Picture this. It is the year 1650 and you are waking up in your home. But here is the thing, your home is not like your home today. You do not have a bedroom. Well, you do, but it is not just yours. It is everybody's. Your spouse is there, obviously, but so are your children, all of them, and your servants. And possibly a guest or two who stay the night, and maybe even some animals, because why not? Everyone is in the same room and this is completely normal. Nobody thinks twice about it. Now you might be thinking, surely rich people had it better, right? They had big houses, fancy furniture, and plenty of space. Well, yes and no. Even the wealthiest families in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries did not have what we would call private bedrooms. They had chambers, sure, but these chambers were not private. They were multi-purpose rooms where people ate, conducted business, received guests, and yes, slept. The concept of a room dedicated solely to sleeping with a door you could close and lock where nobody else was allowed, that simply did not exist yet. Here is something that will blow your mind. The word privacy itself did not exist in most European languages until the 1800s. Think about that for a second. There was no word for it because there was no concept of it. In Dutch, for example, the word for privacy only started appearing in newspapers in the 19th century. Before that, what would you even call it? How do you describe something that nobody has ever experienced? Let us go back even further to medieval times. Life back then was lived almost entirely in public. There was this thing called the Great Hall. If you've ever seen a medieval movie or visited a castle, you know what I am talking about. The Great Hall was the heart of every household. It was where people worked during the day, where they ate their meals, where they conducted business, and where they slept at night. The lord and lady of the house might have had a chamber on the upper floor, but even that was not truly private. It was more of a status symbol than anything else. It said, "Look, I am important enough to have my own room." But even in that room, servants slept on the floor ready to attend to their master's needs at any moment. And we are not just talking about poor people here, we are talking about everyone. Kings, queens, dukes, merchants, farmers, everyone lived this way. Privacy was not something you could buy because it did not exist as a commodity. You could not go to a store and purchase privacy. There was nowhere to get it. Society simply had not invented it yet. Now you might be wondering, how did people deal with this? How did they handle intimate moments? How did they have any sense of personal space? The answer is they did not. At least not in the way we understand it today. People in the early modern period had a completely different relationship with their bodies, their space, and their sense of self. What we consider deeply personal and private, getting dressed, bathing, going to the bathroom, even having sex, these were all things that happened in front of other people. Not because people were exhibitionists, but because there was simply no other option. Let me give you a specific example. In Scotland and Ireland during the 1600s, entire families would sleep on earthen floors covered with straw and rushes. They would have one blanket to share among all of them, or sometimes just their clothes to keep warm. Even families that were a bit better off might only have one mattress stuffed with rags, and that was used by the husband and wife. Everyone else slept on the floor, and when bad weather came or when darkness made travelling dangerous, any visitors would simply bed down with the family for the night. It was expected. It was hospitality. Here is where it gets even more interesting. As we move into the 16th and 17th centuries, we start to see some changes. Houses start to have more rooms, the middle class is emerging, people are building homes with an upper floor, and on that upper floor there is a space dedicated to sleeping. But here is the catch, it is still not private. Everyone who lives in the house still sleeps in that same space. The master and mistress of the house have a bed, and that bed is the most expensive thing they own. I'm not exaggerating. In most households, the bed accounted for more than 1/3 of the value of all their possessions. It was a major investment. So naturally everyone used it. Children slept in the same bed as their parents. Servants slept in the same room, sometimes on smaller beds or pallets on the floor. And when guests came to stay, they joined in too. There is this fascinating account from early 19th century Ireland that describes the sleeping arrangement in a typical household. The eldest daughter would sleep closest to the wall farthest from the door. Then all the other sisters arranged by age. Then the mother, then the father, then the sons in succession, and finally any strangers, whether it was a travelling peddler, a tailor passing through town, or even a beggar seeking shelter for the night. Everyone lined up in order and everyone slept together. Can you imagine? And this was not considered weird, this was normal. In fact, if you had insisted on sleeping alone, people would have thought you were strange. They might have worried about your mental state. Why would anyone want to be alone? Being alone was dangerous. It was cold, it was isolating. Safety, warmth, and companionship came from being together, always together. Now let me tell you about someone who documented this beautifully. There was a man named Samuel Pepys, and he kept a diary in the 1600s. Pepys was a naval administrator in London, and he wrote about everything in his life, his work, his meals, his arguments with his wife, and yes, his sleeping arrangements. Pepys frequently slept with male friends when they stayed over, and he actually rated them on their conversation skills. He had favourites. One friend he particularly enjoyed sleeping next to was someone he called Merry Mr. Creed, who he said provided excellent company throughout the night. They would lie in bed together talking for hours, and this was completely normal. There was nothing unusual about it. It was just what people did. Fast forward to 1776, and we have another famous example, Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Yes, those founding fathers had to share a bed at an inn in New Jersey. They had one small room with one small bed and one tiny window. Adams wanted the window closed because he was afraid of the night air. Franklin wanted it open because he believed fresh air was essential for health. They argued about it all night. Franklin eventually won, and he proceeded to lecture Adams about his theories on fresh air and respiration until Adams fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. This story is hilarious, but it also shows us something important. Even two of the most important men in American history had to share a bed, and nobody thought twice about it. So why did all of this exist? Why was privacy not a thing? There are several reasons, and they all tie together. First, there is the architecture. Homes were simply not built with privacy in mind. They were built for efficiency, for warmth, and for communal living. Walls were expensive, rooms were expensive. Heating was nearly impossible, so everyone huddled together in one space around one fire. Separating people into different rooms would have been wasteful and uncomfortable. Second, there is the economy. Most people were not wealthy enough to afford large homes with multiple rooms. Even if they wanted privacy, they could not have it. The only people who could afford big houses with lots of rooms were the nobility, and even they did not use those rooms for privacy. They used them for status and display. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there is the culture. Society simply did not value privacy the way we do today. In fact, in many ways, privacy was viewed with suspicion. There was a popular proverb during this time that said, "Do nothing privately which you would not do publicly." The idea was that if you were doing something in secret, you were probably doing something wrong. Honest people had nothing to hide, so why would you want to hide? This attitude was reinforced by the church, which taught that God sees everything anyway, so what is the point of trying to be private? You cannot hide from God, so why try to hide from your fellow man? This mindset extended to the legal system as well. Ecclesiastical courts, church courts, had the power to investigate people's private lives, especially when it came to matters of sex and marriage. If someone suspected that you were having an affair or engaging in premarital sex or committing adultery, they could report you to the church authorities. And those authorities would investigate. They would question your neighbours. They would question your servants. They would even question you under oath about the most intimate details of your life, and you had to answer. There was no right to remain silent. There was no right to privacy, because privacy as a concept did not legally exist. So what does all of this mean? It means that for the vast majority of human history, people lived their lives under constant observation. There was no escape. There was no moment when you could truly be alone with your thoughts, alone with your body, alone with your feelings. Every action, every word, every gesture was witnessed by someone else. And this shaped people in profound ways. It shaped how they thought about themselves, how they interacted with others, and how they understood the world. But here is the fascinating part. Even though privacy did not exist, people still craved it. Deep down, humans have always wanted moments of solitude, moments of intimacy, moments where they could be themselves without judgment. And so in the absence of true privacy, people found creative ways to carve out little pockets of semi-privacy. They used curtains around their beds to create a sort of room within a room. They waited until the middle of the night when everyone else was asleep to have quiet conversations or intimate moments with their spouses. They found corners, alcoves, and hidden spaces where they could steal a few minutes alone. And slowly, very slowly over the course of several centuries, the idea of privacy began to emerge. It started with the wealthy and the nobility who could afford to build homes with separate rooms and corridors. It spread to the middle class as they grew wealthier and more influential. And eventually, by the 1800s and 1900s, privacy became something that most people in Europe and America could experience at least to some degree. But it took a long, long time. And along the way, there were some absolutely bizarre rules and customs that developed around this emerging concept of privacy. The early modern period, roughly 1450 to 1800, was a time of transition. It was a time when people were starting to want privacy, but society had not yet figured out how to provide it. And so you had these strange contradictory situations where people tried to maintain some sense of personal space while still living in a fundamentally public world. You had elaborate rules about who could enter whose bedroom and when. You had ceremonies and rituals designed to give the illusion of privacy while actually being completely public. You had people spying on each other, not out of malice, but because it was considered normal and even necessary. And that is what makes this period so fascinating. It is a window into a world that is completely alien to us, yet also strangely familiar. Because at the end of the day, people back then were just like us. They wanted love, comfort, dignity, and yes, a little bit of space to themselves. But the world they lived in made that almost impossible. And the ways they tried to cope with that, the rules they created, the customs they followed, those are some of the funniest, strangest, and most revealing aspects of human history. So as you lie in your bed tonight, in your private room with your door closed and your thoughts your own, take a moment to appreciate what you have. Because for most of human history, this was an impossible luxury. The privacy you enjoy right now, the solitude, the peace your ancestors could only dream of this. And the journey from their world to ours is a story worth telling. But we are just getting started. Because if you think sleeping arrangements were strange, wait until you hear about what happened when royalty woke up in the morning. Wait until you hear about the most elaborate, most public, most absolutely ridiculous morning routine in history, the awakening ceremony of King Louis XIV of France. That is where things get truly wild. 100 noblemen gathered every single morning just to watch the king get dressed. And it was not just about getting dressed, it was about power control and the most intricate social choreography you've ever heard of. So stay with me as we step into the golden bedchamber of the Sun King and witness one of the most bizarre spectacles in all of European history. Now let me take you to the most opulent palace ever built, where privacy was not just absent, it was weaponized. Where the simple act of getting out of bed became a carefully choreographed performance involving a cast of 100. Where the King of France turned his morning routine into the greatest show on earth. Welcome to Versailles and the utterly bizarre world of King Louis XIV. The year is 1682. The Palace of Versailles has just become the official residence of the French royal court. This place is beyond imagination. Hundreds of rooms, miles of corridors, gardens that stretch to the horizon, and fountains that require more water than the entire city of Paris. Between 3,000 and 10,000 people live here at any given time, and at the centre of it all is one man, Louis XIV, the Sun King, and every single morning something absolutely extraordinary happens in his bedroom. Imagine being so powerful that your bedroom becomes the most important room in an entire nation. Not a throne room, not a council chamber, your bedroom. Louis XIV understood something that most rulers did not. He understood that power is not just about armies and laws. Power is about attention. Power is about making people want to be near you, even when you are doing the most mundane things imaginable. Like getting dressed. So he created a ceremony. And this was not just any ceremony. This was theatre. This was politics. This was social engineering at its finest. Every morning the king would wake up and the ritual would begin. But here is the truly wild part often. Louis had already been awake for hours. He would wake up early, go hunting, ride his horse through the forests around Versailles, and then come back and get into bed. Why? Because the ceremony required him to be in bed. The illusion of waking up was more important than actually waking up. Let me walk you through what happened because you need to understand just how elaborate this was. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, the first valet of the bedchamber would enter the king's bedroom. This man, and only this man, had the privilege of sleeping in the king's room. He would approach the bed where Louis lay behind heavy curtains and say the magic words, "Sire, it is time to get up." Not, "Your Majesty, good morning," not "Wake up, sleepyhead." It had to be those exact words. "Sire, it is time to get up." The curtains would be opened slightly, and the first physician and the first surgeon would enter. They would examine the king to make sure he had survived the night. And then, if the king had a childhood nurse still living, and for much of his reign he did, she would enter and kiss him. Just imagine being the most powerful man in Europe and every morning your elderly nurse kisses you good morning while doctors watch. But this was tradition, and tradition was everything. Now the chamber pot was removed. Yes, the king had used a chamber pot during the night and someone had the job of taking it away. This was actually considered an honour. We will talk more about chamber pots later, but for now, just know that even the king's bodily functions were part of the public ritual. Then the curtains would close again. For about 15 minutes, the king would have a moment of relative privacy. Relative because the first valet was still there. But compared to what came next, this was solitude. At 8:15, the Grand Chamberlain would be summoned, and he would bring with him the nobles who had the privilege of the grand entrée, the grand entrance. These were the most powerful men in France, dukes, princes, the highest-ranking nobles. They had earned or purchased the right to enter the king's bedchamber during this first stage of waking. Now the curtains would open fully and the king would sit up in bed. He would be handed a dressing gown. A servant would hold a mirror for him. Not a mirror on a table like normal people have, but a handheld mirror, because the king did not have a toilet table. He was not a normal person. Every other day the king would shave himself, and these nobles would stand there watching him shave. Can you imagine the most important men in France standing in a semicircle watching their king scrape hair off his face? But wait, we are not even close to done, because this was just the petit lever, the small awakening. This was the private part. Now came the grand lever, the grand awakening. And this is where things got truly insane. More courtiers would be admitted. There were different categories of entry, different levels of privilege. Some men had the première entrée, the first entrance. Others had the entrée de la chambre. Each group would be called in at a specific time in a specific order. Who got to enter when was determined by birth, by favour, by position, and sometimes by payment. Yes, you could actually buy your way into the king's bedroom. Families would save for generations to purchase the right for their sons to watch the king get dressed. As each group entered, the king would continue dressing. But he did not just get dressed. Every single item of clothing was handed to him by a specific person. The shirt was presented by one noble, the breeches by another, the stockings by another, the shoes by yet another. And the honour of handing the king his clothing was so important, so prestigious, that grown men would fight over it. Literally fight. There are records of arguments, of feuds, of political machinations all over who got to hand the king his left shoe. The Duke of Saint-Simon, a nobleman who lived at Versailles and wrote detailed memoirs about life there, described the scene. He said that as the king was putting on his shoes and stockings, everyone was there. By the time the ceremony was finished, there were approximately 100 men in that room. 100 men all dressed in their finest clothes, all standing perfectly still, all watching the king put on his pants. Why? Why would anyone do this? Why would the king allow it, and why would these nobles consider it an honour? The answer is brilliant and twisted at the same time. Louis XIV was playing a very sophisticated game. By making his morning routine into a public ceremony, he accomplished several things at once. First, he controlled the nobility. In previous centuries, powerful nobles would stay on their estates, build up their own armies, and challenge the king's authority. Louis changed that. He made Versailles the centre of everything. If you wanted power, if you wanted influence, if you wanted favour, you had to be at Versailles. You had to be in the king's presence. And the way to be in the king's presence was to attend these ceremonies. So all the most powerful families in France sent their sons to Versailles, where they lived, in tiny apartments, spent fortunes on clothes and gambling, and competed for the privilege of watching the king wake up. Second, he created a hierarchy based entirely on access to himself. In most societies, power is about what you own or what you control. But Louis made power about proximity. How close could you get to the king? When were you allowed to enter his chamber? Could you speak to him directly, or did you just stand there silently? These questions determined your entire social standing, and Louis controlled all of it. He decided who got what privilege. He could grant or revoke access on a whim. One morning he might speak warmly to a nobleman and ask about his family. The next morning he might ignore him completely, and everyone would notice. Everyone would understand that man had fallen from favour. There is a famous quote attributed to Louis. When someone asked him for a favour on behalf of a nobleman, he would often reply, "We never see him." That was code. It meant that the nobleman did not spend enough time at Versailles. He was not playing the game. And if you were not playing the game, you got nothing. No appointments, no honours, no influence. Louis wanted the nobility close where he could watch them, where they would be too busy competing with each other to plot against him. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Louis made himself into something more than human. By turning every action into a ritual, he became a kind of living god. The courtiers did not just watch a man get dressed, they participated in a sacred ceremony. The king's body was not just a body, it was the body of France. When you handed the king his shirt, you were serving the nation. When you watched him put on his shoes, you were witnessing the renewal of royal power. It sounds absurd, but it worked. For decades it worked beautifully. Let me give you a specific example of just how seriously people took this. There was a very precise order to who entered when. The people with the grande entrée came first, then those with the première entrée, then those with the entrée de la chambre. And within each group there was a hierarchy. Birth trumped everything. A prince of the blood, someone related to the royal family, had precedence over a duke. A duke had precedence over a count, and so on. But here is where it gets interesting. Sometimes two men would have equal rank. So how do you decide who goes first? They would literally flip a coin. There are records of this. Two nobles dressed in silk and velvet flipping a coin in a hallway outside the king's bedroom to determine who gets to walk through the door 30 seconds before the other one. And people cared. They cared desperately. Because your position in this ceremony determined your position in society. If you entered early, you had prestige. If you entered late, you were nobody. And if you were not invited at all, you might as well not exist. Now once the king was fully dressed, he would kneel before an altar in his bedchamber and say his prayers. Everyone would kneel with him. Then he would stand and the procession would form. The king would walk from his bedchamber through the hall of mirrors, with all these nobles following behind him in strict order. They would proceed to the chapel where the king would attend mass, and the entire court would watch, again. Then at 1 o'clock in the afternoon the king would eat lunch, alone, technically. He would sit at a table in his bedchamber facing the windows, but the room would be full of courtiers. All the men who had attended the morning ceremony were invited to watch him eat. So he would sit there in private, eating his meal while dozens of men stood around watching him chew his food. And this was considered normal. This was how a king lived. But here is my favourite detail. At night, the whole thing happened in reverse. It was called the coucher, the going to bed ceremony. The king would undress in front of everyone in the same elaborate ritual with the same hierarchy, the same careful choreography. And then he would get into bed, the curtains would close and everyone would leave. Except the first valet, who would sleep in the room, ready to wake the king in the morning and start the whole thing over again. Think about what this meant for Louis. Every single day from the moment he woke up until the moment he went to sleep, he was on stage. He was never truly alone. He was never truly private. Even his most intimate moments, dressing, undressing, eating, praying, were public performances. Some historians argue that this must have been exhausting, that Louis must have resented it. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Louis loved it. He had designed it Bour's way. He thrived on it. He lived until the age of 76, and he maintained this routine almost every single day for over 50 years. His successors, though, were not so enthusiastic. Louis XV, his great-grandson, hated the ceremonies. He found them oppressive and exhausting. He would skip them whenever possible, retreating to his private apartments, where he could actually be alone. Louis XVI, who would eventually lose his head in the French Revolution, also avoided the ceremonies. The courtiers complained bitterly. They said they never saw the king anymore, not like in the good old days under Louis XIV. And maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe by abandoning these ceremonies, the later kings lost their grip on the nobility. Maybe privacy for a king was a luxury they could not afford. There is something deeply ironic about all of this. Louis XIV had everything a human being could want. Wealth, power, palaces, art, music, the finest food, the most beautiful gardens. But he did not have privacy. He could not have it. Because privacy would have meant weakness. Privacy would have meant that he was just a man, not a god. So he sacrificed his privacy on the altar of power, and for him it was worth it. But what about everyone else? What about the nobles who attended these ceremonies? They were willing participants. They fought for the privilege, but they were also trapped. Once you entered the world of Versailles, once you started playing this game, you could not leave. You had to keep attending. You had to keep competing. Because if you stopped, if you went back to your estate and lived a normal life, you would lose everything. Your position, your influence, your relevance. The king would say, "We never see him," and you would be finished. So they stayed. They spent their inheritances on fancy clothes. They lived in cramped apartments. They woke up at dawn to attend a ceremony where they stood silently for an hour watching a man get dressed. And they told themselves it was worth it, because they were close to power. They were in the presence of the king, and in that world that was everything. Now you might be thinking this is all very fascinating, but what does it have to do with privacy? Everything. Because Louis XIV took the already existing lack of privacy in early modern Europe and turned it into a weapon. He took something that was already normal, the fact that people lived public lives, and he weaponized it. He made public observation into a tool of control. He proved that if you take away someone's privacy completely, if you turn their entire existence into a performance, you can control them absolutely. And here is the scary part. It worked. It worked so well that other European monarchs tried to copy it. Courts all over Europe started developing elaborate morning and evening ceremonies. Everyone wanted to be like Louis. Everyone wanted to harness the power of public ritual because they had seen what it could do. But of course, for every person at the top who benefits from this system, there are thousands of people below who suffer from it. And we have only talked about royalty and nobility so far. What about regular people? What about the people who did not live in palaces, who were not playing games of court intrigue? How did they experience this world without privacy? Well, their stories are even stranger. Because while Louis was performing his morning routine for 100 nobles, millions of ordinary Europeans were living in conditions that would shock us even more. And that is where we are going next. To the ordinary bedrooms of ordinary people where the rules about privacy were not elaborate ceremonies, they were simply non-existent. Where entire families along with servants, guests, and sometimes even strangers all shared the same bed, and where the solutions people invented to cope with this lack of privacy were both ingenious and utterly absurd. Let us leave the golden halls of Versailles behind and step into a world that is far more intimate, far more uncomfortable, and somehow even stranger. Because if you think watching a king get dressed is bizarre, wait until you hear about where ordinary people actually slept, and more importantly, who they slept with. Close your eyes for a moment and picture your bed. Your bed. The place where you retreat at the end of a long day, where you can finally be alone with your thoughts, where nobody is watching you, where you can let your guard down completely. Now imagine that bed filled with 5 other people. Your spouse, yes, but also your children, your teenage daughter on one side, your 10-year-old son on the other, your elderly mother at the foot. And oh, by the way, there is also a stranger there. Someone you met on the road today who needed shelter from the rain. He is sleeping between your husband and your oldest son. Everyone is touching. Everyone can hear each other breathe. There is no escape. This was not a nightmare. This was Tuesday night in 17th century Europe. Let me introduce you to a historian named Roger Ekirch. In the early 2000s, he published a book called A Day's Close Night in Times Past. And in this book, he documents something that most of us have never even considered. For the vast majority of human history, beds were not private spaces. They were not even personal spaces. They were communal furniture, and everybody shared them. Not because people wanted to, but because they had to. Here is a fact that will change how you think about history. In most households in early modern Europe, the bed was the single most expensive item they owned. We touched on this briefly earlier, but I want you to really understand the economics here. A decent bed with a wooden frame, a mattress filled with straw or feathers, and maybe some basic curtains could cost more than 1/3 of everything a family owned. In some cases, it represented an entire year's wages. Imagine spending your entire annual salary on your bed. That is how expensive they were. So naturally, if you finally managed to save up enough money to buy a bed, you are not going to waste it by having each person sleep alone. That would be insane. That would be like buying a car and only letting one person ride in it ever. No, if you had a bed, everybody used it. And I mean everybody. Let me paint you a very specific picture, because the details here are what make this real. In Ireland, during the 1600s, a typical rural family would live in a one-room cottage, maybe 2 rooms if they were lucky. When night fell, the entire family would prepare for bed, and there was a very specific order to how people arranged themselves. This is documented. This is not speculation. People wrote about this. The eldest daughter would sleep closest to the wall, farthest from the door. Why? For protection. If someone broke in during the night, they would have to get through everyone else first. Then came the rest of the daughters, arranged by age, oldest to youngest, then the mother, then the father, then the sons again in order by age, and then at the very edge of the bed closest to the door, any guests or strangers who had sought shelter for the night. Think about that for a second. If you were travelling through Ireland in 1600 and something and a storm rolled in and you knocked on someone's door asking for a place to stay, they would invite you in. And at bedtime you would climb into bed with the entire family. You would lie down next to people you had never met before, and everyone would just go to sleep. Because that was normal. That was hospitality. Now you might be thinking, surely this was just poor people, right? Surely wealthier families had separate beds for their children, and the answer is sometimes, but not really. Even in relatively prosperous households, beds were scarce. Children doubled up, siblings shared, and servants almost always slept in the same room as their employers, often on small beds called trundle beds that could be pushed under the main bed during the day, or on simple pallets on the floor. But here is where it gets even more complicated. It was not just family and servants, it was also guests, and not just overnight guests, long-term guests. You see, in early modern Europe, wealthy people travelled a lot. They would visit friends and relatives and stay for weeks or even months. And when you were a guest in someone's home, you did not get your own room. You got to share a room, and often you got to share a bed. There is this wonderful account from a noble woman in France named Madame de Liancourt. In the 17th century, she wrote a letter to her granddaughter giving her advice about running a household. And one piece of advice was this: do not share your bed with your female servants. Why did she need to say this? Because it was common practice. Noble women would sleep in the same bed as their maids. Madame de Liancourt thought this was inappropriate. She said it goes against cleanliness and decency, and that it blurs the social boundaries between mistress and servant. But the fact that she had to say this tells us that lots of other noble women were doing it, and there were reasons beyond just economy. One reason was safety. A woman alone in a bedroom was vulnerable. If she had an abusive husband, if she feared an intruder, if she simply felt anxious in the dark, having another person in the bed with her provided protection and comfort. Ekirch documents cases where female servants would sleep with their mistresses, specifically to protect them from violent husbands. The presence of a witness would make the husband think twice before becoming physically abusive. Another reason was warmth. We have talked about this before, but I cannot emphasize it enough. Houses in the early modern period were cold, brutally cold. Heating a large space was nearly impossible. Most families could afford one fire in one room. At night, that fire would die down. The temperature would drop, and the only way to stay warm was to huddle together under blankets. Multiple bodies meant more warmth. It was basic survival. But beyond survival, there was also a cultural element. People simply did not value solitude the way we do today. In fact, they feared it. Being alone was associated with melancholy, with madness, with danger. Remember, this was a time before electric lights, before street lights, before any kind of artificial illumination beyond candles and oil lamps. Nighttime was dark, truly profoundly dark, and darkness was terrifying. People believed that evil spirits roamed at night, that witches held their meetings, that all sorts of supernatural dangers lurked in the shadows. Being alone in the dark was genuinely frightening. But being together, that was safe. That was comforting. So communal sleeping was not just practical, it was psychologically necessary. It was how people maintained their sanity in a world that was much scarier than ours. Now let me tell you about someone whose name you definitely know, but whose sleeping arrangements you probably do not. Remember Samuel Pepys, the diarist from London? I mentioned him briefly earlier. Well, Pepys kept incredibly detailed records of his daily life, including who he slept with, and he slept with a lot of different people. Not sexually, I want to be clear about that, but literally sharing a bed. When male friends stayed over, Pepys would share his bed with them, and he would write about it in his diary. He would rate their conversation skills, their snoring habits, whether they were restless sleepers or peaceful ones. One of his favourite bed companions was a man he called Merry Mr. Creed. Pepys loved sleeping next to this guy because they would stay up late into the night talking about politics, gossip and philosophy. It was like a very long sleepover with your best friend, except both of you were grown men with jobs and responsibilities. And nobody thought this was strange. Nobody questioned it. Male friends sleeping together was completely normal. Female friends sleeping together was completely normal. It was just what people did. But of course, all of this raises an obvious question. What about sex? What about intimacy between married couples? If you are sharing a bed with your spouse, but also with your children, your servants, and possibly a stranger or two, when exactly are you supposed to have a private moment with your partner? The answer is the middle of the night. Historians have found evidence that couples would wait until everyone else was asleep and then very quietly, very carefully, they would engage in intimate relations under the covers, trying desperately not to wake anyone. Can you imagine having to time your intimate life around the sleep schedules of 6 other people in the same bed? The stress, the awkwardness, the sheer logistical nightmare of it all. And of course it did not always work. People woke up, children heard things they should not have heard, servants gossiped. It were messy and complicated and profoundly unromantic. But it was life. It was just how things were. Now there is a darker side to all of this that we need to acknowledge. When children share beds with adults, when there are no boundaries between public and private space, when nobody has any place to retreat to abuse, becomes much easier. Historians have documented countless cases of children being taken advantage of in these communal sleeping arrangements, whether by relatives, by servants, by guests. The lack of privacy created an environment where vulnerable people had nowhere to hide and no way to protect themselves. This is one of those aspects of history that is uncomfortable to talk about, but important to understand. The absence of privacy was not just inconvenient or awkward. For some people, especially women and children, it was dangerous. It created situations where power imbalances could be exploited with impunity. And there was no social framework for addressing it, because the entire concept of personal space and bodily autonomy did not really exist yet. Let me share one more example that really drives this home. In the early 1800s, during the Great Famine in Ireland, investigators went into rural areas to document living conditions, and what they found was shocking even by the standards of that time. Families of 8 or 10 people living in one-room cottages with earthen floors. No furniture except perhaps one table and one bed. At night, some people would sleep on the bed. Others would sleep on piles of straw on the floor. And in the winter, they would bring their animals inside for warmth. So you might have a family of 10 humans and 3 pigs all sleeping in the same room, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. The investigators were horrified. They wrote reports about the degraded conditions, about how these people were living like animals. But here's the thing, for those families this was normal. This was how their parents had lived, and their grandparents and their great-grandparents. They did not know anything else. The idea of each person having their own room, their own bed, their own space that was not even conceivable. It was so far beyond their experience that they could not even imagine it. And this was not just in Ireland. Similar conditions existed across much of rural Europe and even in urban areas among the poor. In cities like London and Paris, working-class families lived in single rooms in massive tenement buildings. 10 or 12 people in one room, beds in shifts. Some people sleeping during the day because they worked at night, others sleeping at night because they worked during the day. The room was never empty, there was never silence, there was never solitude. So what did people do? How did they cope? Well, they developed strategies. Small, clever ways to carve out tiny moments of semi-privacy within this fundamentally public existence. And the most important strategy, the one that almost everyone who could afford it used, was bed curtains. Heavy fabric curtains that hung around the bed, creating a sort of room within a room. We are going to talk about these in detail very soon, because they are fascinating. But for now, just understand that curtains were the closest thing most people had to a door they could close. The other strategy was timing. People learned to wake up earlier than everyone else or stay up later just to have a few minutes alone. They would take walks by themselves. They would find quiet corners in gardens or fields. They would create little rituals of solitude wherever they could. Because even though society did not value privacy, individual humans still craved it, still needed it. And very slowly over centuries that individual craving began to change society. Wealthy people started building houses with more rooms. They started putting corridors between rooms so you did not have to walk through someone's bedroom to get to yours. They started giving children their own spaces. And gradually, very gradually, the idea emerged that maybe, just maybe, people deserved a little bit of privacy. That maybe sharing a bed with 7 other people was not actually the ideal way to live. But that change took a long time, and during the transition some truly bizarre things happened. People tried to maintain old communal traditions while also embracing new ideas about privacy. They created rules and customs that make no sense to us now but made perfect sense to them, like bed curtains that provided the illusion of privacy while everyone could still hear everything, like elaborate etiquette around bedrooms that determined who could enter when and under what circumstances, like public ceremonies for things that we consider deeply private. And speaking of bed curtains, it is time we talked about them properly. Because if there was one invention, one piece of technology that defined the early modern approach to privacy, it was the curtained bed, the four-poster bed with heavy fabric hangings that could be drawn close, sealing you off from the world. These beds were everywhere. Rich people had them. Middle-class people saved up for them. Even some poor people found ways to hang simple curtains around their sleeping spaces. And these curtains did something remarkable. They created privacy where none existed. They gave people a way to be alone together, to have intimate conversations, to shield themselves from the gaze of others, all while still being in a room full of people. They were ingenious, they were beautiful, and they were absolutely essential to survival in a world without privacy. Let us step inside those curtains now and discover the secrets hidden behind the fabric. There is something magical about pulling a curtain closed. That soft swish of fabric, that sudden sense of enclosure, that feeling that you have just created your own little world separate from everything outside. For people in the early modern period, that simple act of closing a bed curtain was the closest thing they had to closing a door. It was the only wall between them and the rest of humanity. And let me tell you, those curtains had to work overtime. The four-poster bed with its heavy hangings was not just furniture. It was architecture. It was a room within a room, a sanctuary within a public space, a desperate attempt to create privacy where absolutely none existed. And the fascinating thing is that these beds were everywhere. If you visit any historic house in Europe from the 16th or 17th century, you will see them. Massive wooden frames with posts at each corner stretching up toward the ceiling, draped in yards and yards of fabric. Some of them are so elaborate, so ornate, that they look like something out of a fairy tale. But they were not decorative, they were essential, they were survival tools. Let me take you inside one of these beds, because understanding how they worked will help you understand just how desperately people craved even the tiniest bit of privacy. The bed frame itself would be solid and sturdy, usually made of oak or another hardwood. At each corner, tall posts would rise up, sometimes 6 or 7 feet high. These posts supported a wooden canopy called a tester that covered the top of the bed like a roof. And from this canopy, curtains would hang down on all 4 sides. Now, these were not thin, flimsy curtains like you might have on your windows today. These were serious curtains, heavy wool in the winter, thick linen or cotton in the summer, sometimes silk or velvet if you were wealthy. And they did not just hang there loosely. They were designed to close completely, sealing off the bed from the rest of the room. When you climbed into bed and pulled those curtains shut, you were in your own little fabric cave. Dark, enclosed, private. The curtains served multiple purposes, and this is where the ingenuity really shows. First and most obviously, they provided warmth. Remember, there was no central heating. Most rooms did not even have fireplaces. At night, the temperature would drop dramatically. Stone walls would radiate cold, wooden floors would freeze your feet. But inside those curtains, with your body heat trapped by all that heavy fabric, you could actually stay warm. It was like having a tent inside your house. Second, the curtains blocked drafts. Medieval and early modern buildings were notoriously drafty. Windows did not seal properly. Doors had gaps. Cold air would whistle through the rooms all night long. But those bed curtains acted as a windbreak. They created a still pocket of air around the bed, protecting the sleepers from those icy drafts that could make sleep impossible. Third, and this is crucial, the curtains created the illusion of privacy. Notice I said illusion. Because let us be clear, these curtains did not actually make you invisible or inaudible. If you were in a room with 6 other people and you closed your bed curtains, those people still knew you were there. They could hear you breathing, they could hear you moving, they could hear you talking. The curtains were not soundproof, they were not magic, but they did something important. They created a visual barrier. They said, I am here, but you cannot see me. And in a world where being seen was constant and inescapable, Not being seen even for a few hours was precious beyond measure. There is a beautiful phrase that historians use to describe what these bed curtains created. They call it a room within a room, and that is exactly what it was. The bedroom might be full of people, but inside those curtains you had your own space. You could whisper with your spouse without everyone hearing every word. You could cry without being watched. You could simply exist without being observed. It was not perfect privacy, but it was something. Now let us talk about the status symbol aspect of these beds, because this is where things get really interesting. In early modern Europe, your bed was a statement. It told everyone who saw it exactly where you stood in society, and people judged. Oh, how they judged! The quality of your bed frame, the richness of your curtains, the elaborateness of your bed hangings, these things mattered enormously. Wealthy families would spend absolutely staggering amounts of money on their beds. We are talking about sums that would make your head spin. There are records from England of beds that cost more than a small house. A bed owned by a nobleman might have curtains made of silk damask embroidered with gold and silver thread, trimmed with expensive lace and decorated with elaborate fringes and tassels. The curtains alone could weigh 50 or 60 pounds. And they were not just pretty, they were investments. When a wealthy person died, their bed hangings would be carefully divided up among their heirs because they were so valuable. Let me give you a specific example. In the early 17th century, there was a noblewoman in England named Bess of Hardwicke. She was one of the wealthiest women in the country, and she was obsessed with textiles. When she died, an inventory was made of all her possessions, and it listed her bed hangings in meticulous detail. One bed had curtains made of fabric striped with gold and silver, with gold lace around the edges and gold twist running down the seams. Another had curtains in alternating panels of different coloured silk, with the seams covered in silk lace woven with gold and silver thread. These were not just beds, these were works of art. They were portable wealth, they were proof of status. But here is what is fascinating. Even people who were not wealthy tried to have nice bed curtains. Middle-class families would save for years to afford a set of decent wool curtains. They would pass them down through generations. A bride might receive bed hangings as part of her dowry, and she would treasure them for her entire life. Because having bed curtains meant you were respectable. It meant you had achieved a certain level of dignity. It meant you were not sleeping on the floor like an animal. There was also a practical reason why people invested so much in bed curtains. They lasted. Unlike the bed frame itself, which might rot or break good quality fabric, could last for decades if you took care of it. Families would have winter curtains made of thick wool and summer curtains made of lighter cotton or linen. They would swap them out seasonally, and when the curtains started to wear out, they would repair them, patch them, and keep using them. Some sets of bed hangings stayed in families for 100 years or more. Now let us talk about what actually happened inside those curtains, because this is where it gets intimate. The bed was not just for sleeping. It was the one place in the house where people could have private conversations. Husbands and wives would wait until the curtains were closed, and then they would talk. Really talk. About things they could not discuss during the day when servants and children were listening. About their fears, their hopes, their frustrations with their lives. Historians have found that the bed was where women in the early modern period had the most power. During the day in the public spaces of the house, women were expected to be obedient and submissive. But at night, behind those curtains, the dynamic changed. Wives could voice concerns that would be inappropriate in public. They could negotiate with their husbands. They could say no. The bed was neutral territory, and the darkness and privacy emboldened women to speak more freely. Roger Eckhirsch, the historian I mentioned earlier, writes about this beautifully. He says that lying in bed in the dark encouraged wives to express concerns unsuited to other hours. Sexual boundaries were redrawn. The bed became a place where women could reclaim some autonomy within a patriarchal household. It was not much, but it was something. And that something was only possible because of those curtains. The bed was also where siblings shared secrets, where parents told bedtime stories, where grandparents passed down family history. All those whispered conversations, all those intimate moments, they happened behind curtains in the dark when the rest of the world was shut out. But those curtains could not block everything, and this is where we need to talk about the less romantic side of bed curtains. They were dark, they were stuffy, and they trapped everything inside, including bad smells, including disease, including insects. Bed bugs were absolutely rampant in early modern Europe. Almost everyone had them. They lived in the mattresses, in the bed frames, and yes, in the curtains. At night, they would crawl out and bite you, and there was not much you could do about it. You could try to clean your bedding, but the bugs always came back. Some people would spread herbs or grasses under their sheets hoping to repel the bugs. Some would try vinegar or other home remedies, but mostly people just lived with them. Bed bugs were part of life. The curtains also trapped moisture and heat, which created perfect conditions for mold and mildew. And in the winter, when people closed the curtains tight to keep warm, the air inside would become stale and foul. People would breathe the same air all night long, and by morning, it would be thick and unpleasant. Some doctors started to worry that bed curtains were actually unhealthy. By the late 18th century, there was a growing movement among physicians who argued that fresh air was essential for health and that these heavy curtains were trapping bad vapors and causing illness. But most people ignored these warnings. Because the alternative, sleeping without curtains exposed and visible, was simply too awful to contemplate. The psychological need for privacy outweighed the physical concerns about air quality. People would rather risk their health than give up that tiny bit of privacy. There is something poignant about that choice. Think about what it means. People valued privacy, so much needed it so desperately that they were willing to sleep in conditions that were uncomfortable and potentially dangerous just to have a few hours hidden from view. That tells you everything you need to know about how unbearable life was when you were constantly observed. Now, as we move into the 18th century, we start to see changes. Wealthier families begin to build houses with separate bedrooms, real bedrooms with walls and doors that close. And when people had actual walls and actual doors, they started to question whether they still needed those heavy curtains. Some people kept them for tradition's sake or because they still valued the warmth, but others started to favour lighter curtains or no curtains at all. The four-poster bed with its heavy hangings began to look old-fashioned, a relic of a more crowded, less private age. But for millions of people, especially the poor and the working-class, bed curtains remained essential well into the 19th century. If you lived in a one-room cottage, if you shared your space with your entire family, those curtains were still your only privacy, and people clung to them. There is a wonderful moment in history that captures this transition perfectly. In the mid-19th century, a woman in Massachusetts named Lydia Emerson inherited a beautiful four-poster bed from her aunt. The bed came with 2 sets of curtains. One set was made of tan chintz printed with bright flowers. The other was white cotton dimity, considered much fancier. When Lydian was pregnant with her first child, she had the white dimity curtains hung on the bed because they were more elegant. But her husband, Ralph Waldo Emerson, yes, the famous philosopher, looked at them and said they had too much parade, too much show, too much fuss. So she took them down, deferring to his opinion. But then when she was pregnant with her second child, she had those curtains hung again, and this time she kept them up. She used them during her recovery period after giving birth, and apparently Ralph Waldo Emerson either did not notice or did not object. Lydian wanted her curtains. She wanted that sense of enclosure, that feeling of privacy during a vulnerable time. and she got them despite her husband's earlier objection. That little story tells us so much. By the mid-1800s, bed curtains were becoming optional, even controversial. Some people saw them as old-fashioned or excessive, but for women especially, they still represented something important. A barrier, a boundary, a way to control who could see you, and when. Today, almost none of us have bed curtains. We do not need them. We have walls instead. We have doors that lock. We have bedrooms that are ours and ours alone. The four-poster bed with its heavy hangings has become a decorative choice, something you might see in a fancy hotel or a historic house museum. We have forgotten what they were really for. We have forgotten that for centuries a piece of fabric hanging from a wooden frame was the only thing standing between a person and complete, total, suffocating publicity. So the next time you close your bedroom door at night, take a moment to appreciate it. Because your door does what those curtains could never quite manage. It actually gives you privacy, real privacy, the kind of privacy that people in the past would have considered an impossible luxury. But even with their curtains and their clever timing and their whispered conversations, people in the early modern period still could not escape one fundamental truth. They were always being watched. And sometimes that watching was not passive. Sometimes people actively spied on each other. Sometimes neighbours would quite literally peek through holes in the wall to see what their neighbours were doing. And far from being scandalised by this behaviour, society actually encouraged it. Because if everyone is watching everyone else, how can anyone get away with anything sinful or immoral? That is the logic anyway. And it led to some truly bizarre situations where privacy was not just absent, it was actively violated on purpose with the full blessing of the law. Let us step into that strange world of sanctioned spying now, where being a peeping Tom was not just acceptable, it was practically a civic duty. It was a Friday evening in the year 1610 in the English town of Gloucester. A man named Humphrey Philpot was sitting in his home, and he had a problem. His neighbour, a woman named Joan Anslet, was married to a man named Richard. But Richard was away, and Humphrey had noticed something suspicious. A man named Michael Payne kept visiting Joan whenever her husband was out. Too often, too regularly. And tonight Michael Payne had come calling again. Now what would you do in this situation? Would you mind your own business? Would you maybe have a quiet word with Richard when he got back? Would you feel uncomfortable about the whole thing and try to ignore it? Well, Humphrey Philpot did none of those things. Instead, he did something that to our modern minds seems absolutely insane. He summoned 4 of his neighbours, and together all 5 of them took turns peeking through a hole in the wall to watch what Joan and Michael were doing. And what they saw as recorded in the legal documents that have survived to this day was this Michael Payne and Joan Anslet in bed together. Michael was half naked. They were embracing and kissing in the most notorious and scandalous manner. The 5 neighbours watched this intimate scene. They watched, they witnessed, and then they did what any good citizen of early 17th century England would do. They reported it to the ecclesiastical authorities, the church court. And Joan and Michael were brought up on charges of adultery. Let that sink in for a moment. 5 men stood in line, taking turns to spy through a hole in the wall, watching 2 people in what they believed to be a private moment. And nobody thought this was wrong. Nobody questioned whether maybe, just maybe, this was an invasion of privacy. Because in early modern Europe there was a widely held belief that went something like this: if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And if you are hiding something, the community has not just the right but the duty to uncover it. There was a proverb that people quoted all the time during this period. It went, "Do nothing privately which you would not do publicly." Think about what that means. It means that privacy itself was viewed with suspicion. It means that if you wanted to do something away from the eyes of others, you must be doing something wrong. Honest people, moral people, godly people, they had no need for privacy. They could do everything out in the open because they had nothing to be ashamed of. This was not just folk wisdom, this was backed up by religious teaching. The church taught that God sees everything. God knows every thought in your head, every action you take, every word you speak. You cannot hide from God, so what's the point of trying to hide from your fellow humans? In fact, trying to hide was almost seen as evidence of guilt. If you were innocent, why would you seek privacy? And this attitude extended into the legal system in ways that are genuinely shocking to us today. The ecclesiastical courts, the church courts, had enormous power in early modern Europe. They had jurisdiction over anything related to morality, marriage, or religion, and they took their job very seriously. If someone suspected you of adultery, of fornication, of any kind of sexual impropriety, they could report you, and the court would investigate. But here is the thing, the court did not have police officers or private investigators. They relied on the community. They relied on neighbours watching neighbours. They relied on servants reporting on their employers. They relied on people like Humphrey Philpott, who would quite literally spy through walls and then come forward as witnesses, and this was not just tolerated, it was encouraged. You were doing your civic and religious duty by keeping an eye on your neighbours and reporting anything suspicious. Let me give you another example, because this one case might sound like an anomaly, but it was not. It was completely normal. In the church court records from all over England, from the 1500s through the 1700s, you find case after case of neighbours testifying about the private lives of other neighbours. They would report when someone stayed out too late at night, when unmarried couples were seen together, when someone was heard making suspicious noises in their bedroom, when someone's clothing was dishevelled, when someone was seen entering or leaving a house at an odd hour. And the level of detail in these testimonies is astounding. People would describe exactly what they saw, exactly what they heard, exactly what time it happened. They'd been watching, carefully, constantly, and they were not ashamed of it. In fact, they were proud of it. They were protecting the moral fabric of the community. Now you might be thinking, surely people resented this. Surely people wanted to be left alone, and the answer is yes and no. Some people clearly did want privacy. That is why they closed doors, drew curtains, and tried to conduct their intimate affairs in secret. But at the same time, many people genuinely believed that this surveillance was good and necessary. They believed that sin thrived in darkness, and that the only way to maintain a godly society was to shine light into every corner, to make sure everyone was being watched all the time. There is a term that historians use for this kind of society. They call it communal regulation of morality, and it was incredibly powerful. In a world without police, without security cameras, without any of the surveillance technology we have today, the community policed itself. And the tool they used was watching, constant, unrelenting, socially sanctioned watching. Let me tell you about the mechanisms of this system, because it was actually quite sophisticated. In many English towns and villages, there were official positions called churchwardens and sidesmen. These were respectable community members whose job was to report moral offences to the ecclesiastical court. They would literally go around the community asking questions, observing behaviour and compiling reports. And people would tell them things, people would come to them with information about their neighbours. But it was not just official positions, the entire social structure supported this surveillance. Servants were expected to report on the behaviour of their employers. Children were expected to report on their parents if they saw something immoral. Guests in your home were potential witnesses against you. Everyone was watching everyone else, and everyone knew they were being watched. And the consequences of being caught could be severe. If you were found guilty of adultery or fornication by an ecclesiastical court, you would have to do public penance. This usually meant standing in front of your entire church congregation dressed in a white sheet and publicly confessing your sin. You would be humiliated in front of everyone you knew. Your reputation would be destroyed. Your family would be shamed. It was devastating. So people tried to be careful. They tried to be discreet, but discretion was almost impossible when everyone was watching. And that is the paradox at the heart of this whole system. People craved privacy, but society denied them privacy and then punished them for trying to have privacy. Now here is where it gets even stranger. The courts did not just rely on people seeing things, they also relied on people hearing things. And in the close quarters of early modern homes with thin walls and shared spaces, you could hear everything. Neighbours would testify that they heard suspicious noises coming from next door. Servants would testify that they heard their master and mistress arguing, or that they heard sounds that suggested intimate activity at inappropriate times. There is a particularly fascinating case from the 1630s in Yorkshire. A servant testified that she had been sleeping in the same room as her mistress and a male guest. She said that in the middle of the night she heard the bed creaking and heard whispered conversation. She could not see anything because it was dark and the bed curtains were closed, but she heard enough to be suspicious, and her testimony was considered valid evidence. The mistress was convicted based on sounds alone. Think about what this means for privacy. Even when you pulled your curtains closed, even when you thought you were hidden, you were not safe, because people were listening, and anything they heard could be used against you. But the surveillance went beyond just watching and listening. People would examine physical evidence. They would look at bed sheets for signs of sexual activity. They would inspect clothing for stains or tears. They would check to see if a bed looked slept in or if 2 beds in a house appeared unused, suggesting that people were sleeping together who should not be. Nothing was too intimate to investigate. Nothing was too private to examine. And here is perhaps the most disturbing part. Women were particularly vulnerable to this surveillance. Because the standards of behaviour were so much stricter for women than for men, a woman could be accused of sexual impropriety for the smallest things. Walking alone at night, speaking to a man unchaperoned, wearing clothes that were considered too revealing, laughing too loudly. The list goes on, and once a woman was accused, the community would turn against her. Neighbours who had been friendly would suddenly remember suspicious things they had seen or heard. The surveillance that had been passive would become active and aggressive. Men faced scrutiny too, of course, but the consequences were usually less severe. A man caught in adultery might have to do penance, but his reputation would often recover. A woman caught in adultery was ruined for life. She might be unable to marry, unable to find work, cast out by her family. The lack of privacy combined with harsh moral standards created a world where women in particular lived in constant fear of being watched and judged. Now, I want to be clear about something. This surveillance culture was not universal. It varied by region, by social class, by time period. In some places and times it was more intense than others. In big cities like London, there was more anonymity. You could disappear into the crowd. You could live your life without everyone knowing your business. But in small towns and villages, which is where most people lived, the surveillance was constant and inescapable. And it was not just England. Similar patterns existed all over Europe. In France, in Germany, in Italy and Spain, everywhere communities watched their members. Everywhere the church encouraged this watching. Everywhere privacy was seen as suspicious and potentially sinful. But here is the fascinating thing. Even in the midst of all this surveillance, people still tried to carve out private moments. They still tried to have secrets. They still tried to create little pockets of intimacy away from prying eyes. And sometimes they succeeded. Not often, not easily, but sometimes. Historians have found evidence of elaborate schemes people used to meet in secret. Lovers would arrange signals, a candle in a window, a particular knock on a door, a specific time to meet. They would use go-betweens to carry messages. They would meet in places where they thought no one would see them, in fields, in barns, in empty churches. They would risk everything for a few moments of privacy. And you know what? Sometimes the community knew, sometimes the neighbours saw, sometimes the servants heard, but sometimes people chose not to report what they knew. Because even in a culture of surveillance, even in a world where watching your neighbour was considered a duty, there was still some small measure of human compassion. Some people understood that everyone has secrets, everyone has moments they would rather keep hidden, and sometimes out of kindness or fellow feeling or just exhaustion with the whole system, people would choose to look away. But you could never count on that. You could never rely on it. Because you never knew who was watching. You never knew who might decide to report you. And that uncertainty was its own form of torture. The constant awareness that at any moment someone might be peering through a gap in the wall or listening at a door or examining your sheets for evidence of sin. There is a psychological term for this kind of constant surveillance. It is called the panopticon effect, the idea that if you believe you might be watched at any time, you start to regulate your own behaviour. You internalize the surveillance. You become your own watcher. And that is exactly what happened in early modern Europe. People learned to police themselves because they knew that someone else might be watching. They learned to hide their true thoughts and feelings to present a facade of respectability, to never let their guard down. And this brings us to one of the great ironies of this period. In a world where privacy did not exist, where everyone was watched, and everything was public, people became experts at deception. They learned to wear masks. They learned to perform propriety even when they did not feel it. They learned to live double lives, a public life of respectability and a private life of secret desires and hidden actions. The lack of privacy did not make people more honest. It made them better liars. So when you think about the early modern period, when you think about life without privacy, do not imagine a world where everyone was open and authentic. Imagine the opposite. Imagine a world where everyone was constantly performing, constantly watching themselves, constantly afraid of being exposed. Imagine the exhaustion of never being able to relax, never being able to truly be yourself. That was the reality. But even as this surveillance culture thrived, even as communities watched and judged and reported something else was happening, slowly, very slowly, ideas about privacy were beginning to change. Some philosophers and thinkers were starting to argue that maybe, just maybe, people deserved some private space. Some zone of life that was theirs alone, where the community and the church had no right to intrude. These ideas would take centuries to become mainstream. But they were beginning. The seeds were being planted. And nowhere was the tension between publicity and privacy more visible than in one specific moment in life. A moment that we today consider deeply private, deeply personal, deeply intimate. But in the early modern period, it was public spectacle. I am talking about childbirth. When a woman gave birth, her bedroom would fill with people. Not just midwives and family, but neighbours, friends, and sometimes even strangers, all there to witness, to help, to gossip, to judge. The most vulnerable moment of a woman's life was turned into a community event, and the reasons why and the ways women tried to navigate this tell us everything about the bizarre relationship early modern people had with privacy. Let us step into that crowded birthing room now and witness just how public-private moments could be. Imagine the most vulnerable moment of your life, the most painful, most frightening, most intimate experience a person can have. Now imagine that moment happening in front of 20 people, neighbours you barely know, women from down the street, relatives you have not seen in years, all crowded into your bedroom watching, commenting, offering advice, gossiping among themselves. This was childbirth in early modern Europe, and it was not just something that happened. It was required, it was expected, it was how things were done. When a woman went into labour in the 16th or 17th century, word would spread through the community, and women would come. They would arrive at the house one by one or in small groups, and they would fill the birthing chamber. Some came to help, some came to witness, some came simply because it was the social thing to do. Childbirth was a community event and everyone had a role to play. Let me take you into one of these rooms, because understanding what actually happened will help you grasp just how utterly bizarre this was. The woman in labour would be in her bed or sometimes in a special birthing chair designed to make delivery easier. The midwife would be there, of course. She was the professional, the expert, the one who actually knew what she was doing. But around her would be a crowd of other women. These were called gossip, though that word meant something different back then. It came from God's siblings, someone who had become a godparent to the child, but over time it came to mean any woman who attended a birth. And these women did not just stand quietly in the corner. They talked. They told stories about their own births. They offered opinions about what the midwife should do. They prayed aloud. They sang. They brought food and drink. They created this atmosphere of noise and activity that seems completely at odds with what we think a birthing room should be like. Today we want birthing rooms to be calm and quiet. Back then they were loud and crowded and chaotic. Now you might be wondering why. Why would anyone want a crowd of people present during such an intimate moment? And there are actually several reasons, some practical and some cultural. First, childbirth was dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Women died in childbirth all the time. Babies died all the time. Having multiple people present meant that if something went wrong, there were people there to help, or at least to witness what happened, to confirm how the woman died so there would be no suspicion of foul play, to testify that everything possible was done to save her. Second, these women provided practical support. They would hold the labouring woman's hands. They would wipe her forehead with cool cloths. They would give her drinks. They would help her change position. Childbirth could last for hours or even days, and having people there to provide physical care was genuinely helpful. Third, and this is important, they provided social legitimacy. The presence of respectable community women confirmed that the birth was legitimate, that the child was born in wedlock, that everything was proper and above board. Remember, in a world where everyone watched everyone else, having witnesses to major life events was crucial. If no one witnessed your child being born, people might question whether the child was really yours, whether you had secretly adopted someone else's baby, whether you had been pregnant at all or had faked it for some nefarious reason. Witnesses prevented these kinds of suspicions, but there was also a fourth reason, and this one is more subtle. Childbirth was one of the few times when women had complete control over a space. Men were not allowed in the birthing chamber. This was exclusively female territory, and for women in the early modern period who had very little power in most areas of life, the birthing chamber was a place where they made the decisions. The midwife was in charge, not the doctor or the husband. The attending women provided support, not men. It was a woman's space, and that was precious. Let me tell you about a specific birth that was documented in detail because it really brings this to life. In 1594, a noblewoman in England named Margaret Hoby gave birth to a child. Margaret kept a diary and she wrote about her experiences. She described how women from the surrounding area came to attend her, how they filled her chamber, how they prayed together and sang hymns, how they told stories to distract her from the pain, and how after the baby was born they stayed for days helping her recover, bringing her meals, caring for the infant. But Margaret's birth was relatively private compared to royal births. When a queen or princess gave birth, the number of witnesses could be enormous. Dozens of people might crowd into the room. Not just women, but sometimes male courtiers and officials too, because They needed to witness that the child was really the Queen's biological child. There could be no doubt about the royal succession, so these high-ranking men would stand in the birthing chamber, averting their eyes perhaps, but present nonetheless. Can you imagine the most powerful women in Europe giving birth with a room full of men watching to make sure no one switched babies? There is a famous case from France in the year 1643. Queen Anne of Austria, the wife of King Louis XIII, gave birth to the future King Louis XIV, and the birth was attended by so many people that the room was stifling. It was September, it was hot, and the chamber was packed with bodies. The Queen was in agony not just from labour, but from the heat and the lack of air, and yet all those people had to be there. Because the legitimacy of the future king depended on having witnesses. Now let us talk about what happened after the birth, because this is where things get even more interesting. After the baby was born, the mother would enter what was called lying in. This was a period of recovery that could last anywhere from a week to a month, depending on the woman's social status and health. During lying in, the woman would stay in bed in her chamber, and she would receive visitors. Lots of visitors. This was another public event. Women from the community would come to see the new mother and the new baby. They would bring gifts. They would offer congratulations. They would examine the baby closely, counting fingers and toes, checking for any signs of abnormality. And yes, they would gossip. They would talk about how the birth went, whether it was easy or difficult, whether the mother screamed a lot or bore the pain stoically, whether the baby was big or small, whether it looked like the father or the mother. Every detail was discussed, analysed, and shared with the wider community. For wealthy women, the lying-in chamber would be decorated elaborately. The bed would have the finest linens. The curtains would be drawn to keep the room dim because bright light was thought to be harmful to new mothers. Special foods would be prepared, broths and caudles, which were warm, spiced drinks mixed with ale or wine. The mother would hold court from her bed, receiving visitors like a queen. And in a way she was a queen. For those few weeks she was the centre of attention, the most important person in the household. But for poorer women, lying in was a luxury they could not afford. They might stay in bed for a few days if they were lucky, but then they had to get up and go back to work. There were meals to cook, children to care for, fields to tend. They did not have servants to do these things for them, and they certainly did not have the leisure to receive visitors and be pampered. This class difference is important to understand. Privacy, or the lack of it, was experienced differently depending on your social status. Wealthy women had more people present at their births because their births were more significant. More people cared about whether the child was legitimate, whether the birth went well, whether the bloodline was secure. Poor women had fewer attendees simply because fewer people cared. But in both cases, the birth was public. It was just public in different ways and for different reasons. Now here is something fascinating. As we move into the 18th century, attitudes start to change. Some women, particularly educated upper-class women, start to push back against this tradition of crowded birthing chambers. They start to want more privacy. They start to limit the number of attendees. They start to exclude people who are not actually helping. And this causes controversy, because the community expects to be involved. Women who had attended births their entire lives suddenly find themselves turned away. They feel insulted. They feel like they are being told their presence is not wanted, their help is not valued, and they complain. There are letters and diary entries from this period where women express their hurt and confusion about being excluded from births. But the women who wanted privacy had their reasons. They were influenced by new medical ideas about fresh air and calm environments. They were reading advice books written by male doctors who were just starting to get involved in childbirth, and who believed that too many people in the room was unhealthy. They were also influenced by changing ideas about emotion and sensibility. There was a growing belief that childbirth was a deeply emotional, almost sacred experience that should be private and intimate rather than public and social. This tension between old communal traditions and new ideas about privacy plays out in fascinating ways. Some women would compromise. They would allow the traditional attendees to be present during labour, but ask them to leave during the actual delivery. Or they would allow them to be present, but ask them to be quieter, less intrusive. It was a negotiation, a slow shift from one way of doing things to another. But let us return to the 16th and 17th centuries, because I want to tell you about one more aspect of public childbirth that is absolutely wild: the churching ceremony. After a woman gave birth, she was considered ritually unclean according to church law. This came from the Old Testament traditions. She could not leave her house, could not attend church, could not participate in normal community life until she had been purified. And the purification happened through a ceremony called churching. When the woman had recovered enough, she would go to church for the churching ceremony. She would be accompanied by the women who had attended her birth, her gossips. They would process to the church together, the new mother wearing a white veil. At the church, the priest would perform a ritual of thanksgiving and purification. The woman would give thanks for surviving childbirth. She would be blessed and welcomed back into the community, and then there would be a feast or celebration. This ceremony was public, very public. Everyone in the community would see the woman going to church. Everyone would know she had just given birth. Everyone would participate in the celebration afterward. Once again, a deeply personal experience surviving childbirth was made into a community event. And women had mixed feelings about this. Some appreciated the churching ceremony. It marked the end of lying in. It meant they could go back to normal life. It was a celebration of survival, which, given the dangers of childbirth, was genuinely something to celebrate. But other women found it intrusive. They found it embarrassing to process through the streets in their white veil with everyone staring. They found the ritual of purification insulting, as if there was something dirty or shameful about giving birth. By the 18th and 19th centuries, many Protestant churches stopped doing churching ceremonies or made them optional, but in Catholic areas they continued well into the 20th century, and the memory of them lingered. My own great-grandmother, who gave birth in the 1930s, told stories about her churching, about how she felt strange and exposed walking to church, even though by that time the tradition was fading. So what do we learn from all of this? What does childbirth tell us about privacy in the early modern period? It tells us that the most vulnerable, most painful, most intimate moments of life were not private. They were witnessed, recorded, discussed, and integrated into the social fabric of the community. Women did not have the luxury of going through this experience alone or with just one or two trusted people. They went through it with everyone watching. And yet women found ways to make these experiences meaningful. They created bonds with other women through shared attendance at births. They passed down knowledge and traditions. They supported each other through the most dangerous thing a woman could do. Yes, the lack of privacy was uncomfortable and sometimes distressing, but the presence of community also meant that women were not alone. They were surrounded by people who had been through the same thing, who they understood, who cared. That is the complicated truth about life without privacy. It was invasive and exhausting and sometimes traumatic, but it also meant that people went through major life experiences together. Nobody was isolated. Nobody was alone. For better or worse, you always had people around you. And while we might not want to return to that world, we can perhaps appreciate some of what was lost when we gained privacy. The sense of community, the shared experience, the knowledge that someone was always there. But if you think childbirth with 20 witnesses was the most public, that intimate moments got weight until you hear about what came next in the life cycle. Because if birth was public, weddings and wedding nights were even more so. And the customs around wedding nights, the things that communities expected to witness, the rituals that had to be performed, the proof that had to be provided, these were so invasive, so shocking that they make everything else we have talked about seem tame. So let us step forward in time from the birthing chamber to the wedding chamber and discover just how thoroughly the most intimate night of a couple's life was turned into a spectator sport. Picture yourself on the most romantic night of your life, your wedding night, the moment you have been waiting for, the moment when you and your new spouse finally get to be alone together. Except that you are not alone. The door opens and in walks your uncle, then your mother, then your best friend, then your neighbours. They are all smiling, they are all congratulating you, and they are not leaving. In fact, they are settling in to stay. Because in early modern Europe, your wedding night was not your private moment. It was their entertainment. The wedding night ceremony was one of the most bizarre customs in all of European history. And what makes it even more bizarre is that it was not some rare practice limited to weird fringe groups. This was mainstream. This was normal. This happened at weddings across Europe, from Scotland to Italy, from the 1500s well into the 1700s. Rich families did it. Poor families did it. Everyone did it. And the level of intrusion was absolutely staggering. Let me walk you through what actually happened, because the details are important. After the wedding feast, which could last for hours with music and dancing and far too much wine, the time would come for the bride and groom to retire to their bedchamber. But they did not go alone. Oh no, they were escorted by everyone. The entire wedding party would process from the feast to the bedchamber, often with musicians playing and people singing bawdy songs. When they reached the chamber, the bride would be undressed by the women in her party. Her mother, her sisters, her close friends, they would remove her wedding clothes and put her in a nightgown or shift. Some accounts describe the women literally stripping the bride down to nothing before putting the nightgown on her. And this was done in front of all the other women present. No privacy, no modesty, just a group activity where everyone helped prepare the bride for bed. Meanwhile, in another room or another part of the same room, the men would be doing the same thing to the groom. They would undress him, often teasing him and making jokes, and put him in his nightshirt. The atmosphere was festive, rowdy, often crude. The men would make jokes about what was about to happen. They would offer advice. They would laugh and drink and make the groom as uncomfortable as possible, all in the name of celebration. Then, once both bride and groom were in their nightclothes, they would be led to the bed. The bride would be helped into bed first by the women. She would be positioned properly, usually sitting up against pillows. Then the groom would be brought in by the men, and he would climb into bed beside her and still nibble leaves. Here is where the customs vary depending on time and place, but the general pattern was this: that guests would crowd around the bed. They would pull back the curtains if there were any. They would look at the couple. They would offer blessings and prayers. Sometimes a priest would be present to bless the marriage bed. Sometimes the guests would sprinkle holy water on the bed or on the couple. Sometimes they would throw grain or flowers for fertility. And then, in some traditions, the guests would wait. They would stand there watching until they saw proof that the marriage was about to be consummated. What kind of proof? Well, in some regions, they wanted to see the couple's bare legs touching. Servants or family members would lift the covers just enough to confirm that the bare skin of the bride's leg was touching the bare skin of the groom's leg. Once that was confirmed, once everyone had seen it, the guests would cheer and finally start to leave. But in other traditions, the guests did not leave until they heard something, until they heard sounds that suggested intimate activity was beginning. Whispers, movement, the creak of the bed. Anything that confirmed the couple was not just lying there frozen with embarrassment, but was actually proceeding with the expected activities. Can you even imagine? Can you imagine being a young bride or groom, knowing that a room full of people is standing outside your curtains, listening, waiting for proof that you are doing what you are supposed to be doing? And then the following morning there was one final invasion of our privacy. The bed linens would be inspected. The sheets would be examined for blood, which was considered proof of the bride's virginity and proof that the marriage had been consummated. In some traditions, the blood-stained sheets would be displayed publicly, hung out a window, shown to the assembled guests, even paraded through the streets in some regions. The most intimate physical evidence of what happened in that bed was turned into a public proclamation. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about why. Why would anyone allow this? Why would anyone subject themselves to this humiliation? And the answers are complex, rooted in the legal and social realities of the time. First marriage in the early modern period was not just a personal relationship, it was a legal contract with enormous implications. Property was transferred through marriage, inheritance rights were established, alliances between families were formalized. All of this depended on the marriage being valid and consummated. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled. It would be as if it never happened. All those property transfers, all those alliances, they would be void. So the community had a vested interest in making sure the marriage was consummated, particularly in wealthy families where large estates and significant sums of money were at stake. Witnesses to the consummation were essential. If years later someone challenged the validity of the marriage, you needed people who could testify under oath that the marriage had been consummated on the wedding night. That testimony could be the difference between inheriting a fortune or losing everything. Second, there was the issue of virginity. In early modern Europe, a bride was expected to be a virgin. Her virginity was not just a personal matter, it was a family matter. It affected her value as a bride, it affected her family's honor. The blood-stained sheets were proof that she had been a virgin, proof that she had not deceived her husband or dishonored her family. Yes, it was invasive, yes, it was humiliating. But it protected her reputation and her family's reputation. Third, and this is darker, the wedding night witnesses served as protection against accusations of impotence or frigidity. If a marriage failed to produce children, the couple could not blame each other for not trying. The witnesses could testify that the marriage had been consummated, that the couple had fulfilled their duties. This might seem strange to us, but in a world where producing heirs was absolutely critical, where childlessness could be grounds for annulment, having witnesses was a form of insurance for both parties. But there was also a fourth reason, one that is more cultural than legal. The wedding night ceremony was a rite of passage. It marked the transition from maiden to wife, from bachelor to husband. It was the moment when two people left their families of origin and formed a new family unit. And in early modern Europe, major life transitions were always public. Birth was public, death was public, and marriage, the consummation of marriage, was public too. It was how society acknowledged and validated the change in status. Now, not everyone participated in these customs with the same enthusiasm. Historical records show that some couples resisted. Some brides and grooms would try to speed the process along, ushering guests out as quickly as possible. Some would negotiate with their families beforehand to limit the number of witnesses, or to skip certain parts of the ritual. And as we move into the 18th century, we start to see more and more resistance to these traditions, particularly among educated urban families, who are adopting new ideas about privacy and romantic love. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, and particularly in rural areas, the wedding night ceremony was still going strong, and it could be quite elaborate. Let me tell you about a royal wedding night, because these were the most extreme examples. When a princess married, when a queen married, the wedding night ceremony could involve dozens or even hundreds of people. Courtiers would crowd into the bedchamber or stand in the rooms adjacent. High-ranking nobles would be given positions close to the bed, while lesser nobles would have to watch from farther away. The entire court hierarchy would be on display based on who got to stand where during the bedding ceremony. There is a detailed account of the wedding night of King Louis XIV of France, yes, him again, and Maria Theresa of Spain in 1660. After the wedding feast, the young king and his new queen were escorted to their bedchamber by a massive procession of nobles. The queen was undressed by her ladies and put to bed. The king was undressed by his gentlemen and brought to the bed. The Archbishop of Paris blessed the marriage bed. And then, only after all the proper rituals had been observed, did the guests finally withdraw, but they did not go far, did not go. They stayed in the adjacent rooms waiting, and the next morning the sheets were examined, and word was spread throughout the court that the marriage had been properly consummated. For royal couples, this public bedding was even more important than for ordinary people. The legitimacy of future heirs depended on it. There could be no doubt that the Queen's children were fathered by the King. There could be no whispers about switched babies or false pregnancies. Everything had to be witnessed and verified. But even for non-royal couples, the pressure was intense. Imagine being 18 or 19 years old. Imagine this is your first time being intimate with someone. And imagine doing it knowing that a group of people is waiting just outside your curtains, listening for proof that you are performing adequately. The anxiety must have been crushing. And here is something that does not get talked about much in history books, but is absolutely relevant. This public pressure to perform on the wedding night must have caused all sorts of problems. Stage fright is real, and it affects physical performance. How many young grooms, nervous and drunk and exhausted from a long day of wedding festivities, found themselves unable to perform while knowing people were listening? How many brides experienced pain and fear, not just from the physical act, but from the knowledge that their suffering was being monitored by others? We do not have good records of this because people did not write openly about sexual dysfunction, but we can infer from other sources that it was a problem. There are medical texts from the period that offer advice to grooms on how to ensure successful consummation. There are prayers and rituals designed to help with performance anxiety. There are even accounts of couples who faked it, making noises and movements designed to convince the listeners that everything was going as expected, even when it was not. And what about the morning after? Imagine waking up and knowing that people are going to inspect your sheets, that they are going to discuss what they find, that your most intimate moment is going to be the subject of gossip and speculation. Some women we know faked the blood. They would use animal blood or berry juice to stain the sheets if there was no natural blood, because the consequences of not having blood-stained sheets could be severe. A bride could be accused of not being a virgin. She could be sent back to her family in disgrace. Her dowry could be reclaimed. Her reputation could be destroyed. So women did what they had to do to survive in this system. They faked it. They cheated. They protected themselves the only way they could. And who can blame them? When the system is designed to humiliate and expose you, when your value as a person is determined by whether your sheets show blood, you do what you must. Now there is a story I want to share that illustrates just how far these customs could go. In some regions of France and Germany there was a tradition called charivari, or rough music. If a marriage was considered inappropriate, if the couple was too old, or if one of them was remarrying too quickly after being widowed, or if there was a large age difference, the community would stage a mock wedding night ceremony. On the actual wedding night, neighbours would gather outside the couple's house with pots and pans and musical instruments. They would bang and clang and make a terrible racket, preventing the couple from sleeping or having any privacy. This could go on for hours or even days. The only way to make it stop was to pay the crowd money or provide them with food and drink. This custom shows us something important. The community believed it had the right to regulate marriage, even the most intimate aspects of marriage. If your marriage did not meet community standards, the community would intervene. They would punish you by denying you even the smallest amount of privacy on your wedding night. It was social control at its most invasive. But as I mentioned earlier, these customs began to change in the 18th century. Enlightenment ideas about individual rights and personal dignity started to filter through society. Romantic love became more valued. People started to believe that marriage should be based on affection and choice, not just on property and family alliances. And with these new ideas came new attitudes about privacy. Upper-class couples led the way. They started to have smaller, more private wedding ceremonies. They started to refuse the traditional bedding ceremony. They would allow perhaps a blessing of the marriage bed, but then they would firmly ask everyone to leave. And because these were wealthy, influential people, they could get away with it. They could say no to tradition. But for poorer people, for people in rural areas, the old customs persisted much longer. There are accounts of public bedding ceremonies happening in some parts of Europe well into the 1800s. Traditions die hard, especially when they are tied to deeply held beliefs about honor, legitimacy, and community values. So what is the legacy of all this? What does it tell us about the relationship between privacy and intimacy in the early modern period? It tells us that privacy was not seen as necessary for intimacy. In fact, privacy was almost seen as suspicious. The lack of witnesses made people nervous. It opened the door to fraud, to deception, to questions about legitimacy. So people chose public verification over private intimacy. They chose legal security over personal dignity, and yet couples still formed intimate bonds, despite the lack of privacy, despite the public nature of their wedding night. Couples still found ways to love each other, to build relationships, to create partnerships that lasted a lifetime. The human need for connection was stronger than the invasive customs of the time. People adapted. They found ways to be intimate within a system that seemed designed to prevent intimacy. But imagine how much energy that took. Imagine how exhausting it must have been to constantly navigate between what you wanted to do and what society expected you to do. To always be performing, always being watched, always having to prove yourself worthy. That was the cost of living in a world without privacy. Not just the physical intrusion, but the emotional and psychological toll of never being able to relax and simply be yourself. And speaking of spaces where you could never relax, where performance was constant and privacy was non-existent, we need to talk about one of the most fundamental changes in architecture that eventually gave people some relief. Because while all these intimate moments were happening under public scrutiny, something revolutionary was being invented. Something so simple that we take it completely for granted today, but which changed everything about how people experience space and privacy. I am talking about the corridor, the hallway, that simple passageway that lets you walk from one room to another without having to parade through someone else's private space. Let us discover how this humble architectural innovation transformed privacy forever. Stand up for a moment. I want you to do something simple. Walk from whatever room you're in right now to another room in your house. Go ahead, walk down your hallway, open at a door and step into a different space. You just did something that would have been absolutely impossible for most of human history. You moved from one room to another without walking through someone else's private space. You did not have to parade through your parents' bedroom to reach the kitchen. You did not have to march through the dining room to get to your own bedroom. You had a hallway, a corridor, a neutral space that belongs to no one and everyone at the same time. This seems so obvious, so basic that you probably never think about it. But corridors are a revolutionary invention, and they did not exist for most of European history. In fact, the first known corridor in a private home was designed by an architect named John Thorpe in 1597. 1597. That is just over 400 years ago. Before that, if you wanted to get from one room to another in a house, you had to walk through all the rooms in between. Let me paint you a picture of what this meant. Imagine a medieval manor house or even an early modern townhouse from the 1600s. The rooms are arranged in a line, one after another. This arrangement is called an enfilade, which is a French word that literally means lined up like a thread. Each room has doors on opposite walls, and these doors line up so perfectly that if you open all of them at once, you can see straight through the entire length of the house. It is actually quite beautiful architecturally, but it is a privacy nightmare. To get to your bedroom at the end of the house, you have to walk through the drawing room, then through the dining room, then through someone else's bedroom, then through a study, then through another bedroom. Every single room is a thoroughfare. There is no way around it. There is no private passage. If you want to get anywhere, everyone sees you coming and going. Now you might be thinking, surely people just went around the outside of the house. Surely there were external corridors or walkways. And the answer is sometimes yes. In grand palaces or monasteries, there might be cloisters or covered walkways around the perimeter. But in most ordinary houses, there was no such thing. If it was raining, if it was cold, if it was nighttime, you were not going outside. You walked through the rooms, and everyone saw you. This had profound implications for privacy. First, it meant that you could not move around your own house without being observed. If you were in your bedroom and you needed to use the privy or get something from the kitchen, everyone would see you make that journey. There was no sneaking around. There was no discretion. Your movements were public knowledge. Second, it meant that certain rooms could not truly be private because they were passageways. If your bedroom was located between two other important rooms, people would be walking through your bedroom constantly. You might be trying to sleep and someone would open your door, walk across your room and exit through the other door. They were not visiting you. They were not invading your space intentionally. They just needed to get from point A to point B, and your room was point B on the way to point C. This is why servants often slept in the same rooms as their employers. It was not just about saving space or providing close attendance. It was because the employers' bedrooms were thoroughfares. Servants needed to pass through constantly to do their work, so they might as well sleep there too. Third, and this is crucial, the enfilade design created a hierarchy of access. The deeper you were in the house, the more private you were. The rooms near the entrance were semi-public, anyone could access them. But to reach the innermost rooms, you had to pass through all the outer rooms first. And that meant the people in those outer rooms saw you. They could stop you. They could question you. They controlled access to the inner sanctum. This was especially important in palaces and great houses. The king's bedroom, for example, might be at the very end of a series of rooms. To reach him, you had to pass through multiple chambers, each guarded by servants and courtiers. Your rank determined how far you could go. Low-ranking visitors might only be allowed into the first or second room. High-ranking nobles could progress further, and only the most privileged could enter the king's actual bedchamber. This is why the levee ceremony we talked about earlier was so important. It formalized who could enter which room and when. Without that formalization, the enfilade design would have been chaos. Anyone could theoretically walk all the way through the house if the doors were open. So strict rules about access were necessary to maintain any kind of order or privacy. But even with strict rules, the system was deeply flawed. It meant to have any real privacy, you needed to be at the very end of the line. You needed to be in the deepest, most inaccessible part of the house. And even then, you were not truly alone because servants still had to pass through. So when John Thorpe designed the first corridor in 1597, he was solving a massive problem. He was creating a way for people to move through a house without invading each other's space. The corridor was a neutral zone. It did not belong to any particular person. It was purely functional. It allowed access to rooms without those rooms becoming thoroughfares. And the implications were revolutionary. With a corridor, you could have a bedroom that was truly private, No one needed to walk through your bedroom to get somewhere else. Your door could remain closed. You could control who entered your space. The corridor gave you autonomy over your own room in a way that had never been possible before. But here is the interesting part. Corridors caught on very slowly. For decades after John Thorpe's innovation, most houses were still being built in the old enfilade style. Why? Because corridors were seen as a waste of space. They were just empty passages. They did not have any function other than movement. In a world where every square foot of a house was precious, where building was expensive and space was limited, dedicating entire areas just for walking seemed absurd. It was not until the late 1600s and early 1700s that corridors started to become common, and even then it was mostly in new houses built for wealthy families. These families could afford the extra space, they could afford the extra construction costs, and they were the ones most influenced by new ideas about privacy and domestic life. There is a fascinating social dimension to the adoption of corridors, and it has to do with class. Corridors were originally invented to separate the upper classes from their servants. In the old enfilade system, servants had to walk through the same rooms as their employers. They saw everything. They heard everything. They were constant witnesses to the lives of the wealthy. And as ideas about privacy and dignity evolved, the wealthy started to find this uncomfortable. They did not want servants walking through their bedrooms. They did not want to see servants constantly. They wanted to maintain the illusion that servants were invisible, that they appeared when needed and disappeared when not needed. But in an enfilade house that was impossible. Servants were always visible because they were always walking through the main rooms. The corridor solved this problem. With corridors, you could design houses with separate circulation routes. The family would use the main rooms and the main corridors. The servants would use back stairs and back corridors. The two groups could move through the same house without constantly encountering each other. It was architectural segregation, and it allowed the wealthy to maintain a fantasy of privacy that the old design had made impossible. But this also tells us something important about privacy. Privacy in the early modern period was becoming associated with class. The wealthy could afford privacy. They could afford houses with corridors and separate rooms. The poor could not. The poor still lived in 1 or 2 room cottages where everyone shared space. Privacy was increasingly a luxury good, something you purchased with money. As corridors became more common in the 1700s, house design began to change dramatically. Architects started thinking differently about space. Rooms no longer needed to be arranged in a line. They could be arranged around a central corridor or around multiple corridors. You could have rooms that opened only onto the corridor, not onto each other. You could have bedrooms clustered in one area of the house and public rooms in another area, with corridors connecting them. This new flexibility led to the development of specialized rooms. You could have a dining room that was only used for dining, not as a passage to somewhere else. You could have a drawing room for entertaining guests separate from the family's private spaces. You could have a library, a music room, a morning room, all these specialized spaces that only became possible once you had corridors to connect them without making them into thoroughfares. And as rooms became more specialized, privacy became more achievable. Each person in a household could have their own room with a door that opened onto a corridor. Children could have their own bedrooms separate from their parents. Husbands and wives could have separate bedrooms if they wished. The corridor made all of this possible. There is a wonderful moment in architectural history that captures this transition. In the early 1700s, many grand houses were renovated to add corridors. Owners would take their old enfilade houses and retrofit them with corridor systems. This was expensive and complicated because you had to essentially carve new passages through existing structures. But people did it anyway. They wanted corridors that badly. They wanted the privacy and convenience that corridors provided. But adding corridors was not just about physical changes to the house. It required changes in social behaviour too. Servants had to be trained to use the back corridors and back stairs. Family members had to learn new patterns of movement through the house. Guests had to be instructed on which doors to use and which passages to avoid. The corridor changed not just architecture, but the entire culture of domestic life. And here is something that does not get talked about much. Corridors changed gender dynamics in the home. In the old enfilade system, women's movement through the house were highly visible. Everyone saw where a woman went and when. This made it difficult for women to have any autonomy or independence. But with corridors, women could move through the house more freely and more privately. They could visit different rooms without everyone knowing. They could have conversations in private. They could control their own movements in a way that had been impossible before. Of course, this applied mostly to wealthy women. Poor women and servant women still lived in cramped, exposed conditions. But for middle-class and upper-class women, the corridor represented a significant increase in personal freedom. It was a small change, but it mattered. By the late 1800s, corridors were standard in almost all new house construction, at least in Europe and America. The old enfilade design had become antiquated, something you only saw in very old buildings, or in palaces that were preserving historical layouts. Modern houses had corridors and people could not imagine living without them. And yet if you had told someone from the 1500s that in 300 years every house would have these empty passages that served no purpose except to let people walk from room to room without being seen, they would have thought you were crazy. They would not have understood why anyone would want that, why anyone would waste space on something so seemingly pointless. But we understand. We understand because we value privacy. We understand because we know what it is like to want to move through our own homes without being observed. We understand because we have experienced the freedom that corridors provide. The simple, humble corridor, just a passage with doors on either side, is one of the most important inventions in the history of privacy. It changed everything. And here is the beautiful irony. Corridors are empty, they are liminal spaces. They are neither here nor there. You pass through them, but you do not stay in them. They are architectural nothingness. And yet that nothingness created the possibility for privacy in every room they connected. By creating a space that belonged to no one, corridors allowed every other space to belong to someone. They were the solution to a problem that had plagued humanity for centuries. So the next time you walk down a hallway in your house, take a moment to appreciate it. That empty passage, that boring corridor, represents hundreds of years of human ingenuity and social evolution. It represents the slow, difficult process of creating privacy in a world that had none. It represents the revolutionary idea that people deserve spaces they can control, spaces where they can be alone, spaces where they can simply exist without being watched. But even with corridors, even with private rooms and closed doors, there was one aspect of daily life where privacy remained elusive. One basic human need that everyone shared, but that remained stubbornly public and embarrassingly exposed. I am talking about going to the bathroom. Or rather, not going to the bathroom, because bathrooms did not exist. I am talking about chamber pots, close stools, and the absolutely mortifying reality of dealing with bodily functions in a world where privacy was still more theory than practice. Let us venture into that uncomfortable territory now and discover just how people managed one of the most private aspects of life in the least private ways imaginable. There are some things we simply do not talk about in polite company. Some bodily functions that remain private, personal, and deeply embarrassing if done in public. But what happens when there is no private? What happens when the most basic human needs must be met in full view of others? Welcome to the world of chamber pots, close stools, and the absolute absence of bathroom privacy in early modern Europe. This is going to get uncomfortable. Let us start with a simple fact that will shock you. Private bathrooms as we know them did not exist until the late 1800s. Indoor plumbing was not common until the early 1900s. For the entire early modern period from the 1400s through the 1700s, people had to deal with their bodily functions without anything resembling a modern toilet. And they had to do it without privacy. In front of family members, in front of servants, in front of guests, because there was simply nowhere else to do it. The most common solution was the chamber pot. You have probably heard of these. They were simple ceramic or metal pots, usually with a handle that people would use to relieve themselves. Every bedroom had at least one, sometimes several. They sat under the bed or in a corner of the room ready to be used whenever nature called. And use them people did with whoever else was in the room, simply pretending not to notice. Imagine this. You are sharing a bedroom with your spouse, your 3 children, and possibly a servant. It is the middle of the night. You need to urinate. You do not leave the room. It is dark, it is cold, and there is nowhere to go anyway. Instead, you reach under the bed, pull out the chamber pot and use it. Right there. With everyone else sleeping just a few feet away. The sound alone would wake people up. The smell would fill the room. But this was normal. This was just what people did. In the morning, someone, usually a servant, if you had one, or the wife or daughter, if you did not, would take the chamber pot and empty it. Where, well, that depended. In cities, there might be designated waste pits or cesspools. In rural areas, people might dump it in the garden where it would serve as fertilizer. And in some places, people simply threw it out the window to throw into the street. Yes, really. There are records of laws being passed in European cities specifically forbidding people from throwing their waste out of windows, which tells you that enough people were doing it to make it a problem. But the chamber pot at least offered some minimal privacy, in the sense that you could use it in your room behind closed curtains if you had them. What was worse was when you needed to use it during the day when the room was full of people who were awake. Then you had to make a choice. Wait until you could find a moment alone, or just use it and hope everyone politely ignored you. Historical records suggest that people did both. There are accounts of people excusing themselves to go use the chamber pot in another room. But there are also accounts of people simply using the pot where they were in full view of others, because waiting was not an option. And remember, in the enfilade houses we just discussed, even if you tried to find privacy in another room, you had to walk through multiple rooms to get there. So everyone saw you carrying your chamber pot, and everyone knew what you were going to do. Now let us talk about something even more mortifying. The close stool. This was a piece of furniture designed specifically for wealthier people who wanted a more dignified way to handle their bodily functions. A close stool looked like a box or a chest with the lid. Inside was a chamber pot. You would sit on top of the box, lift the lid just enough to position yourself and do your business. The box provided some modesty in that you were not squatting over a pot on the floor, and it could be quite ornate. Wealthy families had close stools made of fine wood upholstered with velvet or leather, decorated with brass fittings. They were status symbols. But here is the thing, the close stool did not provide privacy. It was still in your bedroom, people still saw you using it. The only difference was that you looked slightly more dignified while doing so. Some close stools even had arms and backs like chairs. Imagine sitting on an elaborate upholstered chair in your bedroom with your family and servants around using the toilet. That was the height of luxury. And it gets weirder. At Versailles, during the reign of Louis XIV, yes, him again using the close stool was part of the morning routine. During the levee ceremony, after the king got dressed and said his prayers, he would sometimes use his close stool in front of the assembled courtiers. This was considered perfectly normal. Bodily functions were just part of life even for kings. There was no shame attached to it. Or rather, there should not have been shame, though of course people still felt embarrassed. In fact, Louis XIV was known for conducting business while on his close stool. ambassadors would be received, ministers would give reports, important decisions would be made, all while the king sat on his elaborate velvet-covered close stool doing what needed to be done, and everyone pretended this was completely normal and not at all awkward. This tells us something profound about the early modern attitude toward bodily functions. They were not seen as inherently private or shameful. They were just facts of life. Everyone did them. There was no point in pretending otherwise. So you did what you had to do and everyone else looked away or ignored it or carried on with their own activities. But that does not mean people liked it. There is evidence that people found this situation uncomfortable and undignified. They just did not have any alternative. There is a letter from a French noblewoman in the 1600s complaining about having to use a chamber pot in front of visitors. She writes about the embarrassment, the smell, the lack of any private space where she could attend to her needs without being observed. But what could she do? There was no bathroom to retreat to. There was no indoor plumbing. The chamber pot was all she had. Now what about when you were not at home? What about when you were travelling or attending a social event or visiting someone else's house? This is where things get even more complicated. Some wealthy homes had special rooms called garderobes. These were small chambers often built into the thickness of a stone wall, with a shaft that led down to a cesspit or sometimes directly out of the building. You would sit on a wooden bench with a hole in it and a waste would drop down the shaft. Garderobes were more common in castles and manor houses than in ordinary homes, but they did exist. However, garderobes were not always private. Sometimes they were shared. Multiple people might use the same garderobe either at the same time or in succession, and the smell was, as you might imagine, horrendous. Medieval and early modern people tried to mitigate this with herbs and perfumes, but there was only so much you could do. In cities there were public privies. These were communal toilets, usually just benches with holes over a pit. Men and women used them together. There was no separation, no privacy. You would sit next to strangers doing your business, making conversation. Some public privies had partitions between the holes, but many did not. It was a social activity, as bizarre as that sounds to us today. And then there were chamber pots at social events. If you attended a ball or a dinner party or any kind of gathering that lasted several hours, there would be chamber pots available for guests to use. Sometimes these were in designated rooms. Sometimes they were just in corners behind screens or curtains. You would excuse yourself, use the pot and return to the party. Servants would periodically empty the pots and bring in fresh ones. The whole system depended on everyone pretending not to notice what was happening. There is a story from the court of King James I of England that illustrates just how public these arrangements could be. During a royal banquet, several courtiers became ill from eating something that disagreed with them. They needed to relieve themselves urgently, but there was no private place to go, so they used chamber pots right there in the banquet hall behind some hastily arranged screens. The king and the other guests continued eating and talking, as if nothing unusual was happening. But of course everyone knew, everyone heard, everyone smelled. It was mortifying for the sick courtiers, but there was simply no other option. Women faced particular challenges with this system. The elaborate dresses and undergarments of the period made using a chamber pot extremely difficult. Women had to lift layers and layers of fabric, try to position themselves over a pot, and then rearrange everything afterward. It was awkward, uncomfortable, and took a significant amount of time. Some women would bring a maid with them specifically to help with this process. The maid would hold the dress held, position the pot, and then help the lady rearrange her clothing. So even the act of using the toilet required another person to be present. Men had it somewhat easier. They could use chamber pots more quickly and with less fuss, but they still had no privacy, and when they were outside or travelling, they would simply find a tree or a wall and urinate against it. This was considered perfectly acceptable behaviour even for gentlemen. There are paintings and etchings from the period showing well-dressed men relieving themselves against walls in full view of passers-by. Nobody blinked. Now I want to talk about what this meant for people's sense of dignity. Because going to the bathroom is one of those things that we today consider deeply private. We close the door, we lock it if possible, we want to be completely alone. The idea of someone watching us or even being in the same room is horrifying. It violates our sense of personal boundaries in a fundamental way. But people in the early modern period did not have that option. They had to perform their most private functions in public, and this must have been psychologically difficult. We know from diaries and letters that people felt embarrassed, they felt exposed, they wished for more privacy, but they had to cope with the reality of their situation. Some people developed elaborate mental strategies to deal with this. They would focus very hard on other things. They would engage in conversation to distract themselves and others from what was happening. They would use humor to diffuse the awkwardness. They would simply dissociate, pretending they were not really there doing what they were doing. Others became desensitized. If you grow up using chamber pots in front of your family every single day, eventually it loses some of its embarrassment. It becomes routine. You stop thinking about it as much. This is just one more aspect of communal living that you have to accept. But there was always an undercurrent of discomfort, always a sense that this was not ideal, always a wish for something better. And as ideas about privacy evolved, as people started to believe that certain things should be done alone, the chamber pot system began to seem increasingly inadequate. By the 1700s, wealthy families were starting to build small water closets, early versions of toilets in their homes. These were rooms with doors that closed. The toilet itself might be a chamber pot inside a close stool, but at least it was in a private room. This was the beginning of what would eventually become the modern bathroom. But for most people, chamber pots remained the standard for another 100 years or more. There is a certain irony here. We have spent this entire journey talking about how people in the early modern period had no privacy. But in some ways, the lack of privacy around bodily functions was the most psychologically damaging. Because while you might eventually get used to sleeping in a room with 6 other people or getting dressed in front of an audience, there is something about bodily functions that feels inherently private, something that makes us want to be alone. And being denied that privacy day after day, year after year must have taken a toll. Think about what it means to never ever be able to fully relax your body. To always have to be aware that someone might see you, might hear you, might judge you. To have to maintain some level of composure and control even in the most vulnerable moments. That is exhausting. That is a form of constant stress that we thankfully do not have to experience. And yet people lived with it. They adapted. They developed social customs and mental strategies that allowed them to function in a world without bathroom privacy. They showed incredible resilience and ingenuity, but they also must have dreamed of a better way, must have imagined what it would be like to have a door that closed, a room that was truly theirs alone, a moment of peace and solitude in which to attend to the most basic human needs. That better way did eventually come. Indoor plumbing, private bathrooms, locking doors, all of these became standard by the early 20th century. And when they did, I imagine people must have felt an enormous sense of relief. Finally, they had true privacy in at least one area of their lives. But the bathroom was not the only place where privacy was conspicuously absent. There was another daily activity, another basic human need that was also conducted with shocking openness. I am talking about eating, about mealtimes, about the way people consumed food in full view of others, often sharing plates and utensils with none of the boundaries and personal space we take for granted today. The dining table was another stage, another performance, another place where privacy simply did not exist. So let us move from the chamber pot to the dinner table and discover how even the simple act of eating a meal was far more public than you ever imagined. Think about the last meal you ate alone. Maybe you were scrolling through your phone, reading a book, or just sitting quietly with your thoughts. Nobody was watching you. Nobody was judging how much you ate or how fast you ate it. Nobody was commenting on your choices. That simple solitary meal is something people in early modern Europe could hardly imagine, because eating, like everything else we have discussed, was a public performance. And for some people, it was the most public performance of all. We have already talked about Louis XIV and his morning routine. But his eating habits were even more spectacular. Every day at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the king would eat his midday meal. And this was not a private lunch. This was an event called the Grand Couvert, the Grand Table Setting, and it was attended by anyone at court who could get in to watch. The king would sit at a table in his bedchamber, positioned so he faced the windows. He would eat alone in the sense that no one else sat at the table with him, but the room would be packed with people. Courtiers, nobles, foreign visitors, they would all stand around the room watching the king eat. They watched him pick up his fork. They watched him chew. They watched him drink. They observed every single bite, every gesture, every expression on his face. And this happened every single day. Why? Why would anyone want to eat in front of a crowd? And more importantly, why would a crowd want to watch someone eat? The answers are complex and tell us a lot about the relationship between food power and privacy in early modern Europe. First, for the king, eating in public was a display of power and magnificence. The food itself was part of the show. Multiple courses would be brought out: soups, roasts, pastries, fruits. The dishes would be elaborate, expensive, and beautifully presented. Everything from the silverware to the linens to the wine glasses was designed to demonstrate wealth and taste. By eating this meal in public, the king was showing everyone exactly how powerful he was. Look at this abundance. Look at this luxury. This is what I consume every day. Second, the audience benefited from watching. Being admitted to the Grand Couvert was a privilege. It meant you were important enough to be in the king's presence. It meant you had status, so people competed to be there. They dressed in their finest clothes, they observed proper etiquette, they stood for an hour or more just to watch the king eat his lunch, and they considered it an honour. Third, watching the king eat was a form of political access. While he ate, the king might make eye contact with someone. He might nod or smile, he might even speak a few words. These small gestures were enormously meaningful. If the king acknowledged you during his meal, it meant you were in favour. It meant you had influence. So everyone watched the king, hoping to catch his attention, hoping for that moment of recognition. But the Grand Couvert was an extreme example. Most people did not eat in front of audiences of hundreds, but they did eat in front of their families, their servants, and often their guests. And even that level of observation shaped how people experienced food. In wealthy households, dinner was the main meal of the day, usually served in the afternoon. The family would gather around a table, and servants would bring in the food, but those servants would remain in the room throughout the meal. They would stand along the walls ready to refill glasses or bring additional dishes. They would see everything. They would hear every conversation. There was no privacy even during family meals. And the food itself was served differently than we are used to today. Instead of each person having their own plate with their own portions, food was served on large platters called messes. A mess would be shared among several people. You would reach into the communal platter with your fingers or with a knife and take what you wanted. You would eat from the same dish as the person next to you. There was no concept of personal plates or personal space when it came to food. This communal eating style meant that your eating habits were on full display. If you took too much, people noticed. If you ate too quickly or too messily, people noticed. Table manners were incredibly important because everyone was watching. Books of etiquette from the period are full of detailed instructions on how to eat properly in company. Do not grab food with both hands, do not wipe your mouth on the tablecloth, do not pick your teeth with your knife. All of these rules existed because eating was a public activity and you needed to perform it correctly. There was also a hierarchy at the dinner table. The most important person sat at the head of the table and was served first. They also got the best pieces of food. As you moved down the table, both the quality of the food and the speed of service declined. If you were sitting at the far end of the table, you might have to wait a long time before the food reached you, and by then the best pieces would be gone. Your position at the table literally determined how well you ate. For poorer families, communal eating was even more intense. There might be only one bowl for the entire family. Everyone would eat from the same bowl using spoons or pieces of bread to scoop out food. And if you had guests or if servants were present, they might eat from the same bowl too. The distinction between family and non-family, between household members and outsiders, was blurred at mealtimes. Food was shared by everyone present. And let me tell you about an aspect of this that is particularly striking. In many households, there was no separate dining room until the 1700s. People ate in whatever room was most convenient. Often this was the main living area or even the bedroom. The table would be set up for meals and then taken down afterward. So not only were you eating in front of others, you were eating in a space that served multiple other purposes. There was no sacred dining space, no room dedicated solely to meals. The idea of the dining room as a separate specialized space only emerged in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and even then only in wealthy homes. The dining room was part of the same architectural revolution that gave us corridors. As houses became more compartmentalized, as different activities were assigned to different rooms, eating finally got its own dedicated space. But for most people, for most of history, meals happened wherever there was room. Now I want to talk about something that demonstrates just how public eating could be. In some European cities, there was a tradition of public feasts where the entire community would gather to eat together. These were usually held on religious holidays or to celebrate major events. Long tables would be set up in the town square or in the church courtyard. Food would be prepared and distributed, and everyone would eat together, rich and poor masters and servants all mixing together. These public feasts were meant to demonstrate community unity and shared celebration. But they also reinforced the idea that eating was a communal activity, not a private one. You did not retreat to your home to eat alone, you joined the community. You ate in full view of your neighbours. You participated in the collective meal. Even travelling meant eating in public. If you stayed at an inn, you would eat in the common room with all the other guests. There were no private dining areas. Everyone sat at long tables together, sharing food and conversation with complete strangers. And if you were travelling as part of a group, you would all eat from the same dishes, pass around the same cups, and share whatever food was available. There is a fascinating account from a 16th century traveller in Germany who describes dinner at an inn. He writes about how uncomfortable he felt eating with people he did not know, sharing food from common platters, having his eating habits observed by strangers. He felt exposed and judged, but he had no choice. This was how travel worked. This was how inns operated. If you wanted to eat, you did it publicly. Women once again faced particular challenges. In wealthier households, women were expected to eat delicately and sparingly in company. Taking too much food was seen as unladylike. Eating with too much enthusiasm was vulgar. Women had to perform restraint and daintiness at every meal, even if they were genuinely hungry. And because servants and family members were always watching, this performance was constant. There are records of women Eating secretly late at night after everyone else had gone to bed because they had not been able to eat enough during the public meals, they would sneak into the kitchen or the larder and eat leftover food in private. This secret eating was a way of reclaiming some autonomy over their own bodies and appetites. But the fact that it had to be done in secret tells us how constrained women were during public meals. Children were also subject to intense scrutiny at mealtimes. They were expected to eat quietly, to wait patiently for food to be served to them, and to never complain about what they were given. Meals were used to teach children discipline and obedience. And because eating was always public, every meal was a lesson in proper behaviour. Children who misbehaved at the table would be corrected immediately, often harshly, because their behaviour reflected on the entire family. But here is something interesting. Despite all this public eating, or maybe because of it, people developed sophisticated codes around food and hospitality. Offering food to a guest was a sacred duty. Sharing your table with someone created a bond. Breaking bread together was a ritual of trust and friendship. The fact that eating was public meant that it carried social and moral weight. You could not just eat. You had to eat correctly, generously, and in accordance with the expectations of your community. And there were consequences for violating these norms. If you refused to share food with a guest, you would be seen as stingy and inhospitable. If you ate alone when you could have eaten with others, you would be viewed with suspicion. What are you hiding? Why do you want to be alone? Solitary eating was almost seen as antisocial behaviour. It suggested that you were either too proud to eat with your social inferiors or that you had something to hide. By the 18th century, attitudes began to shift. The middle class in particular started to value family meals that were separate from servants and guests. They wanted to eat with just their immediate family in a dedicated dining room with the door closed. This was part of the broader movement toward privacy and domesticity. The family meal became a private ritual, a time for bonding and conversation away from the eyes of outsiders. But even then, servants were often present. It was difficult to have a truly private family meal when servants had to serve the food and clear the plates. Some families tried to minimize servant presence by using dumbwaiters, small elevators that brought food up from the kitchen so servants did not have to constantly enter the dining room. But this was expensive and only available to the wealthy. For most people, dining privacy did not arrive until well into the 19th or even 20th century, and even today in many cultures eating alone is seen as sad or strange. The expectation that meals should be communal, that food should be shared, that eating is a social activity, these ideas have deep roots. They go back to a time when eating alone was not just unusual, but nearly impossible. So what do we learn from all of this? We learn that even the simple act of eating a meal was shaped by the lack of privacy. You could not eat without being observed. You could not control your portions or your pace without others noticing. You could not express hunger or desire without social judgment. Every bite was a public act. And yet people found meaning in this. They created rituals and traditions around communal eating. They used meals to build relationships and demonstrate hospitality. They turned the necessity of public eating into an opportunity for connection. It was not ideal. It was often uncomfortable and constraining. But humans are adaptable. We find ways to create meaning and community, even in difficult circumstances. There is one more area of life, though, where the lack of privacy was not just uncomfortable but genuinely dangerous. One more daily necessity that was conducted with shocking openness, and that put people, especially women, at tremendous risk. I'm talking about bathing and bodily cleanliness, about the ways people wash themselves or fail to wash themselves, and how the absence of private spaces for bathing created health crises and social tensions that we are only beginning to understand. Let us step into the bathing chamber, or rather the lack of one, and explore how people managed personal hygiene in a world that could not even agree on whether bathing was a good idea. When was the last time you took a shower or a bath? This morning, yesterday, a couple of days ago at most now. Imagine going weeks without bathing. Months. In some cases, years. And when you finally did bathe, imagine doing it in front of your servants, your family members, and possibly even guests who happen to be visiting. This was the reality of personal hygiene in early modern Europe. And the attitudes toward bathing were so contradictory, so bizarre, that they created a culture where being dirty was sometimes considered healthier than being clean. Let me start with a fact that will probably disgust you. In the 16th and 17th centuries, many doctors believed that bathing was dangerous. Actually, dangerous. They taught that water opened the pores of your skin, and through those open pores, diseases could enter your body. They believed that the best way to stay healthy was to keep your pores closed, and the best way to keep your pores closed was to avoid water. So the medical establishment was literally telling people not to bathe. This was a dramatic change from earlier periods. In medieval times, public bathhouses were common across Europe. People bathed regularly, sometimes even daily. But by the 1500s, attitudes had shifted dramatically. Part of this was due to the spread of syphilis, which appeared in Europe in the late 1400s and spread rapidly. People noticed that syphilis seemed to spread in bathhouses, where people were naked and in close contact. So bathhouses became associated with disease and immorality. Many were closed down, and bathing in general became suspect. Instead of bathing, people practiced what they called dry cleaning. They would change their linen undergarments frequently, and believed that the clean linen would absorb dirt and sweat from their bodies. The outer clothes would remain unchanged. The same dress or doublet might be worn for weeks or months, but the shirt or shift underneath would be changed daily if you were wealthy or weekly if you were not. And this changing of linen was considered sufficient for cleanliness. There are accounts of wealthy people owning dozens of linen shirts precisely because they changed them so often. Queen Elizabeth I of England was said to bathe only once a month, but she changed her linen undergarments multiple times a day. This was considered the height of cleanliness. Not washing her body with water, but changing the cloth that touched her body. Of course, this system did not actually work. People smelled. They smelled terrible. Body odour was endemic. Everyone stank. To combat this, people used perfumes, lots and lots of perfume. The wealthy would douse themselves in expensive scents made from flowers, herbs, and spices. The poor would use cheaper alternatives like lavender water or rose water. But nobody actually smelled clean. They just smelled like unwashed bodies covered in perfume. And here is where the lack of privacy comes in. When people did bathe, and some people did despite the medical warnings, they did it without any privacy at all. Bathing was not done in bathrooms because bathrooms did not exist. It was done in whatever room was most convenient, usually a bedroom or a dressing room. A large wooden tub would be brought in and filled with water heated over a fire. This was a major undertaking. Water had to be carried bucket by bucket from a well or a river heated in the kitchen, and then carried to wherever the tub had been placed. Because of all this effort, multiple people would often use the same bath water. The most important person would bathe first while the water was clean and warm, then the next person, then the next. By the time the fourth or fifth person got in the water was lukewarm and filthy, but water was too precious to waste. So people shared bath water just as they shared beds and chamber pots and dinner plates. And servants were present throughout the bathing process. They had to be. Someone needed to bring the water, help you get into and out of the tub, wash your back and hair, and then dry you off and help you get dressed. If you were a woman with long hair, you needed help washing it and drying it. If you were elderly or infirm, you needed help with all aspects of bathing. So servants saw everything, every inch of your naked body, every birthmark, every scar, every imperfection. There was no modesty, there could not be. For wealthy women, bathing could be a semi-social event. Friends might visit while you bathed. You would sit in your tub with a towel or sheet draped over the edge for minimal modesty and receive visitors. Conversation would flow, gossip would be exchanged. It was not unlike the levee ceremonies we discussed earlier, except you were naked in a tub. The Marquise de Pompadour, mistress of King Louis XV of France, was famous for receiving guests while in her bath. Artists painted these scenes. They were considered elegant and fashionable, but for most people bathing was not elegant. It was uncomfortable and inconvenient. The water was never quite the right temperature. The tub was small and cramped. You could not really submerge your whole body. You sat in a few inches of water and splashed yourself clean as best you could. And always people were watching, servants doing their jobs, family members waiting their turn. The room you were in was never truly private. Children were bathed even less frequently than adults. There was a belief that children's skin was more delicate and more susceptible to the dangers of water. Some medical texts recommended not bathing infants at all, just wiping them down with oil or cloth. When children were bathed, it was often several at a time in the same tub to save water and effort. So even childhood baths were communal experiences. Now let me tell you about something that sounds almost unbelievable but is well documented. King Louis XIV of France. Yes, him one more time was said to have been afraid of water. Some historians believe he only bathed 2 or 3 times in his entire adult life. Instead, he was rubbed down with perfumed cloths by his servants every morning. This rubbing was done during the levee ceremony, in front of all those courtiers we talked about earlier. So even this minimal form of washing was a public performance. But the king's avoidance of bathing was not unusual. Many aristocrats bathed very rarely. There are records of nobles going years between baths. They relied on perfume powder and frequent changes of linen to maintain the appearance of cleanliness. And because everyone else was also not bathing, the smell was normalized. You did not notice how bad someone smelled because you smelled just as bad. This had profound health consequences. Skin diseases were rampant. Lice and fleas were everywhere. Infections from minor wounds were common because people's skin was so dirty that any break in the skin could introduce harmful bacteria. The lack of bathing contributed to many of the health problems that plagued early modern Europe. But there were some people who resisted the anti-bathing trend. Some regional cultures maintained bathing traditions. In Russia, for example, the tradition of the banya, a steam bath, remained strong throughout this period. Russians would bathe regularly in communal bathhouses, sweating in the steam and then plunging into cold water. And they noticed that they were healthier than their European counterparts who did not bathe. Similarly, in Finland and other parts of Scandinavia, sauna culture persisted. People would gather in saunas, sit in the intense heat, and then cool off by rolling in snow or jumping into icy lakes. These were communal activities done without privacy, but they at least kept people relatively clean. The Ottoman Empire, which bordered Europe, also maintained strong bathing traditions. Turkish baths or hammams were central to Ottoman culture. Both men and women bathed regularly, though, in separate facilities. Europeans who travelled to Ottoman lands were often shocked by how much the Turks bathed. Some saw it as a sign of moral weakness or effeminacy, but others recognised that maybe the Turks were onto something. By the 1800s, attitudes started to shift back. Medical science began to understand the connection between cleanliness and health. The germ theory of disease was developed, and suddenly all those doctors who had warned against bathing looked very foolish. Water was not dangerous. Dirt was dangerous. Bathing became medicalized and recommended, And as bathing became more accepted, the demand for privacy increased. People no longer wanted to bathe in front of servants and family members. They wanted private bathrooms. This led to architectural innovations. Dedicated bathroom spaces were built into new homes. At first, these were just small rooms with a tub and maybe a washstand, but gradually they evolved into the bathrooms we know today with plumbing, toilet sinks, and locking doors. The locking door is key here. For the first time, people could bathe in complete privacy. They could control who saw them naked. They could relax in the tub without worrying about servants entering or family members watching. The bathroom became a sanctuary, a place of genuine solitude and self-care. But this development was slow and uneven. Wealthy people got private bathrooms first, starting in the mid-1800s. Middle-class families followed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but poor people, especially in rural areas, might not have had indoor bathrooms until well into the 20th century. For them, bathing continued to be a communal public activity performed in washtubs or at public facilities. There is something poignant about imagining the first time someone locked a bathroom door behind them and took a bath in complete solitude. That moment of realization, nobody is watching me. Nobody can see me. I am alone with my own being. It must have been extraordinary, liberating. After centuries of being observed during the most vulnerable and intimate act of washing yourself to finally have privacy, it must have felt like a miracle. And it reminds us that privacy, especially bodily privacy, is a relatively recent achievement for most of humanity. For most of history, your body was never truly your own. It was seen by servants, examined by family, judged by community members. Every inch of you was subject to observation and commentary. The idea that you have a right to bodily privacy, that your naked body is yours alone to control and reveal this, is a modern concept. The absence of bathing privacy also reinforced social hierarchies in interesting ways. Servants who bathed their employers saw them at their most vulnerable. They saw bodies that age and sag, that have scars and blemishes, that are simply human. This intimate knowledge could be powerful. Servants knew secrets about their employers' bodies that nobody else knew. And while they were expected to be discreet, the power dynamic was complex. The employer had social and economic power, but the servant had intimate knowledge. For women especially, being bathed by male servants was a source of anxiety and potential danger. Most women were bathed by female servants if possible, but in households without female staff or in situations where help was urgently needed, male servants might be present during bathing. This created situations where women were naked in front of men who were not family members, which violated all sorts of social norms but was sometimes unavoidable. And we cannot ignore the fact that this lack of bathing privacy, like all the other privacy violations we have discussed, must have been traumatic for many people, especially for people who had been abused or who had body shame or who simply craved solitude. Being forced to display your naked body to others, being touched by others during washing, having no control over this most intimate aspect of self-care, this must have caused immense psychological distress for some individuals. The history of bathing privacy is really the history of bodily autonomy. It is about when and how people gained control over their own bodies. When they were able to say, "This is my body and I decide who sees it and who touches it," that seems so basic, so fundamental to human dignity. But it is a right that most people throughout history did not have. So the next time you step into your bathroom and close the door behind you, take a moment to appreciate what you have. A private space, hot, running water, the ability to bathe whenever you want for as long as you want without anyone watching. This is a luxury that would have been unimaginable to your ancestors. This is a form of freedom that billions of people throughout history never experienced. And as we reach the end of our journey through the bizarre world of early modern privacy, or rather the complete absence of it, we need to step back and look at the big picture. We need to understand what all of these stories tell us about human nature, about social evolution, about the meaning of dignity and autonomy. Because privacy is not just about closing doors and drawing curtains, it is about something much deeper. It is about the fundamental question of what it means to be human in society. It is about the balance between community and solitude, between connection and independence, between being seen and being able to hide. So let us bring all of these threads together now and discover what this strange history teaches us about ourselves and about the world we have built. We have travelled through centuries together tonight. We have watched kings wake up in front of audiences. We have seen families sharing beds with strangers. We have witnessed wedding nights turned into spectator sports and childbirths attended by entire neighbourhoods. We have walked through houses without hallways and eaten meals while being constantly observed. We have confronted the uncomfortable reality of chamber pots in bedrooms and the shocking absence of bathing privacy. And through all of this, one question has been quietly growing. How did we get from there to here? How did humanity move from a world with no privacy at all to a world where privacy is considered a fundamental human right? The answer is not simple. It is not a straight line. It is a story of economic change, technological innovation, philosophical revolution, and countless small rebellions by ordinary people who simply wanted a door they could close. Let us start with the economics. Privacy, as we have seen again and again, was expensive. Having your own room required a house with multiple rooms. Having your own bed required enough wealth to afford extra furniture. Having servants meant you never had to be alone, but it also meant someone was always watching. Throughout the early modern period, privacy was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford, and even they did not have much of it by our standards. But as Europe industrialized in the 18 and 1900s, something remarkable happened. The middle class expanded dramatically. More people had disposable income. More people could afford bigger houses. Building techniques improved, making construction cheaper. Suddenly having a house with separate bedrooms for the different family members became achievable for ordinary middle-class families. Privacy went from being an aristocratic privilege to a middle-class expectation. This economic shift was crucial. Because once enough people experienced privacy, once they knew what it felt like to have a room of their own, a door they could close, a space where they could be alone, they did not want to give it up. Privacy became something people fought for, something they demanded, something they saw as essential to a good life. But economics alone does not explain the change. There was also a philosophical revolution happening. During the Enlightenment of the 17 and 1800s, thinkers began to develop new ideas about individual rights and human dignity. Philosophers like John Locke argued that individuals had natural rights that governments and communities could not violate. Among these rights was the right to personal liberty, the right to control your own life, your own body, your own choices. These ideas filtered through society slowly. At first they applied mainly to wealthy men, but gradually they expanded. By the 19th century, people were arguing that everyone, regardless of class or gender, deserved certain fundamental rights, and privacy was increasingly seen as one of those rights. You had a right to your own thoughts, a right to your own space, a right to make decisions without constant observation and judgment. This philosophical shift was reflected in law. In 1892, American lawyers named Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis published a groundbreaking article titled The Right to Privacy. They argued that privacy was not just a social nicety, but a legal right that should be protected. Their article became enormously influential and helped establish privacy as a legal concept in American law. Other countries followed suit. By the early 20th century, privacy rights were being written into laws and constitutions around the world. But perhaps the most important factor in the creation of modern privacy was technology, and I mean that in the broadest sense. The invention of corridors, as we discussed, was a technological innovation that made privacy architecturally possible. The development of indoor plumbing meant that people could have private bathrooms. The spread of gas lighting and later electric lighting meant that people could have light and warmth without needing to gather around a single fire. Central heating meant that people could have their own rooms without freezing. Each of these technological advances made privacy more practical. They removed the economic and practical barriers that had made privacy impossible for so long. You no longer needed to share a bed to stay warm. You no longer needed servants present at all times to help with basic tasks. You no longer needed to walk through other people's rooms to get to your own. Technology made isolation possible, and once it was possible, people embraced it enthusiastically. But here is where the story gets interesting. Because at the exact moment when privacy was finally becoming achievable, when ordinary people were finally getting their own rooms and their own space, new technologies emerged that threatened to take it all away. The telephone, the camera, the recording device. Suddenly you could be heard or seen or documented even in your own private space. The walls that had been built to create privacy were being pierced by new technologies, and this tension has only intensified in our own time. Today we have more physical privacy than anyone in history. Most of us have our own rooms, our own bathrooms, doors that lock. We can be alone whenever we want. And yet we are also more observed than anyone in history. We carry devices in our pockets that track our location, record our conversations, and document our lives. We share intimate details about ourselves on social media. We willingly give up informational privacy in ways that would have shocked our ancestors. There is a strange irony here. People in the early modern period had no physical privacy but complete informational privacy. Nobody was tracking their movements. Nobody was recording their conversations. Nobody had a database of their preferences and behaviors. They were constantly observed by the people immediately around them, but anonymous to the wider world. We have the opposite situation. We have physical privacy, but almost no informational privacy. We can close our bedroom doors, but corporations and governments know things about us that even our closest friends do not know. We're alone in our rooms, but never truly alone. Always connected, always tracked, always observed by distant systems that turn our lives into data. So what do we learn from the bizarre history of early modern privacy? What does it teach us about our own time? I think there are several profound lessons here. First, privacy is not natural. It is not something humans have always had or always wanted. For most of human history, people lived in tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy would have seemed strange, even threatening. It is only in the last few centuries that we have come to see privacy as essential, and that tells us something important. Privacy is a cultural value that we have chosen. It is not inevitable. It is something we created because we decided it was important. Second, privacy is deeply connected to power. Throughout our journey tonight, we have seen how privacy, or the lack of it, was used to control people. The king's lever ceremony controlled the nobility by making access to the king's private space a privilege to be earned. Surveillance of sexual behavior controlled women by threatening them with public shame. The inability to be alone made it difficult for people to develop independent thoughts or identities. Privacy is freedom. The freedom to think your own thoughts, make your own choices, and be yourself without constant judgment. Whoever controls privacy controls power. Third, privacy is not all or nothing. We've been talking about privacy as if it is one thing, but actually it is many things. Physical privacy, informational privacy, social privacy, emotional privacy. You can have one without the others, and different cultures, different time periods, and different individuals value different kinds of privacy. There is no universal right answer to how much privacy people need. It is a negotiation always ongoing, always changing. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, privacy has costs as well as benefits. When we gained privacy, we lost something too. We lost the constant presence of community. We lost the deep knowledge of our neighbours' lives. We lost the sense that we were all in this together, sharing everything good and bad. Modern life can be lonely in ways that early modern life never was. Yes, people back then had no privacy, but they also had no isolation. They were never truly alone. For better or worse, they were always surrounded by people who knew them, who cared about them, who were part of their daily lives. Today, many people feel desperately lonely despite living in cities with millions of others. We have privacy, but we have lost connection. And maybe that is the great challenge of our time, figuring out how to have both. How to have the privacy we need to be individuals, while also maintaining the connections we need to be part of a community. The people of early modern Europe did not have that problem. They had connection in abundance. Too much connection, perhaps. They were never alone, never unseen, never able to escape the constant presence of others. And they coped with it through incredible resilience and creativity. They created rituals and customs that gave structure to public life. They found tiny moments of semi-privacy behind curtains and in the middle of the night. They adapted their psychology to function in a world of constant observation, and slowly over centuries they built the world we now inhabit. A world with closed doors and private bathrooms and rooms of our own. They did not do it through grand revolutions or dramatic proclamations. They did it through thousands of small shakers. An architect drawing a corridor here, a family insisting on separate bedrooms there, a philosopher arguing for individual rights, a technology making solitude possible. Little by little, privacy was invented, but it was never complete, it was never perfect, and it was never available to everyone equally. Even today, privacy remains a privilege. The wealthy have more privacy than the poor. The powerful have more privacy than the vulnerable. Some people can afford homes with many rooms and high walls. Others live in crowded apartments where privacy is still a luxury. The struggle for privacy is not over. It continues. As you lie in your bed tonight in your private room with your door closed and your thoughts your own, remember what a rare and precious thing you have. Remember that for most of human history, this simple moment of solitude was impossible. Remember all the people who lived and died without ever experiencing true privacy. Remember the servants who were never alone, the women who bathed in front of strangers, the couples who consummated their marriages with listeners outside the curtains, the children who shared beds with strangers, the kings who woke up in front of audiences. They were not so different from us. They had the same needs, the same desires, the same wish for moments of quiet solitude. But their world could not give it to them. Our world can. That is progress. That is something to be grateful for. But it is also something to protect. Because privacy once lost is very difficult to regain. And there are forces in our world, technological, economic, political, that would happily take our privacy away if we let them. So cherish your closed doors, appreciate your private bathrooms, value your quiet moments alone. They are gifts from history bought with centuries of gradual change. They are not guaranteed, they are not forever. They are fragile achievements that each generation must protect and pass on. And the next time someone tells you they have nothing to hide, or the next time someone suggests that privacy does not matter, tell them this story. Tell them about the people who lived without privacy. Tell them about the exhaustion of constant performance, the trauma of constant observation, the loss of dignity that comes from never being able to be alone. Tell them that privacy is not about hiding shameful things, it is about protecting the sacred space where you can be yourself, unobserved and unjudged. Privacy is the right to be human, messy, imperfect, vulnerable human, and that right was hard won over centuries. Let us not give it up lightly. Thank you so much for staying with me through this long journey into the past. I know it has been strange, uncomfortable, and sometimes shocking, but I hope it has also been enlightening. I hope you see your own life a little differently now. I hope you appreciate the simple freedoms you have. The closed door, the private room, the moment alone in a new way. If you enjoyed this journey through history, if it made you think or feel or see the world differently, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment telling me what surprised you most, what made you grateful, what made you uncomfortable. Share this with someone who loves history or who takes their privacy for granted. Let us keep this conversation going. And please subscribe to this channel if you have not already. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more strange corners of history to explore, so many more moments when we can look back at our ancestors and think, how on earth did they live like that? I promise you there are more bizarre, fascinating, mind-blowing stories waiting. Stories that will make you laugh, make you cringe, and make you appreciate the modern world in ways you never expected. Until next time, sleep well in your private bedroom. Close your door, turn off your lights, and enjoy the precious solitude that so many before you never had. Good night, and thank you for listening.